Every tired mind you see during the day is carrying more than it ever says out loud. Behind the calm voice, behind the routine, behind the smile people think means everything is fine, there is often a storm no one else can see. The thoughts that do not stop, the tension sitting quietly in the body, the old pain that returns at night, the pressure to keep going, even when something inside has been begging for rest for a very long time. Not because you are broken, but because the world taught you how to survive, not how to truly soften. Most people know how to stay busy. Very few know how to become still. We were taught to solve, to chase, to carry, to hold everything together, to silence the body and ignore the mind until both become heavy, to call exhaustion normal, to call inner noise strength. But deep inside, there is another part of you asking for something more honest, something slower, something healing, not distraction, but restoration. The Stoics understood a truth that many people spend their whole lives missing. A disturbed mind cannot find peace by force. A tired soul cannot heal through more pressure. Real calm begins when you stop wrestling with every thought, when you stop treating every feeling like a threat, when you learn to sit with yourself without fear. That is where the reset begins, not outside you, but within you. Tonight, this meditation is your return, a return to silence, a return to steadiness, a return to the part of you that does not need to rush, prove, or carry the whole world alone. This is your time to loosen the mind, relax the body, and let the noise finally fall away. A total mind and body reset, a deep, stoic rest, and maybe, if you let it happen, the beginning of a quieter and stronger life. And as the body begins to slow down, as the breath becomes softer, something deeper starts to reveal itself. Not the noise, not the distractions, but the quiet truth that has been sitting underneath everything all along. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep alone cannot fix, a heaviness that follows even after a full night's rest. It shows up in the way the shoulders stay tense for no clear reason, in the way the mind keeps running, even when nothing urgent is happening, in the way silence feels uncomfortable instead of peaceful. This is not physical exhaustion. It is something more subtle and more draining. It comes from carrying a version of yourself that was never meant to be carried all the time. From a young age, most people begin to build an identity, a role, a way of being that fits expectations, the strong one, the calm one, the responsible one, the one who never complains, the one who always knows what to do. At first, this feels useful. It helps you move through the world. It earns approval. It creates a sense of control. But over time, something begins to shift. What was once a choice becomes a constant performance. Even when no one is watching, the role does not turn off. The mind keeps repeating it. The body keeps holding it. The face keeps wearing it. And slowly, without noticing, a person forgets how to simply be, without needing to act like someone. This is where the real exhaustion begins, because performing an identity takes energy, not just physical energy, but mental and emotional energy. Every reaction is filtered, every thought is checked, every feeling is managed. There is always a quiet pressure to maintain the image, to stay consistent, to not break character. And this pressure does not disappear at night. It follows into silence. It follows into rest. So even when the day ends, the mind does not fully relax. It keeps asking, am I doing this right? It keeps replaying conversations. It keeps preparing for tomorrow. It keeps holding on to a version of the self that feels safe, but also feels heavy. This is why many people lie down, close their eyes, and still feel awake inside. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that much of human suffering comes not from life itself, but from the stories we attach to who we think we must be. They taught that identity is not something to cling to tightly, but something to observe lightly. Because the moment you believe you must always be a certain way, you lose the freedom to rest. Think about it carefully. If you believe you must always be strong, then you will resist softness. If you believe you must always be in control, then you will resist uncertainty. If you believe you must always be understood, then you will resist silence. And in that resistance, tension grows. The body feels it, the mind carries it, and over time it becomes a quiet burden that never fully leaves. But there is another way, a quieter way, a stoic way. Instead of holding tightly to an identity, you begin to loosen your grip. You stop asking, "Who do I need to be right now?" and start asking, "What is actually happening right now?" This shift is small, but powerful, because it brings you out of performance and into presence. When you are present, you are not trying to prove anything. You are not trying to maintain an image. You are simply aware. Aware of your breath, aware of your thoughts, aware of your body as it is, without forcing it to be different. And in that awareness, something softens. The need to perform begins to fade. The pressure to be consistent begins to loosen. The identity that once felt necessary starts to feel optional. You begin to see that you are not the role you play. You are the awareness behind it. And awareness does not get tired in the same way performance does. This is where true rest begins. Not by changing everything about your life, not by fixing every thought, but by gently stepping out of the constant effort of being someone and allowing yourself to simply exist. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. There may be a moment where the mind tries to pull you back. It may say, "You are being lazy," or "You should be doing something," or "This is not enough." But notice that voice. Do not fight it. Do not follow it. Just see it for what it is. Another layer of the identity trying to stay in control, and then return to the breath. Return to the body. Return to the quiet space where nothing needs to be performed. This is not giving up. This is not losing yourself. This is remembering that you were never meant to carry a fixed version of yourself every second of your life. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to exist without explanation. And in this permission, the exhaustion begins to lift. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but slowly, gently, like a weight being set down after being carried for too long. And as that weight softens, the mind becomes quieter, the body becomes lighter, and rest, real rest, begins to feel possible again. And once that invisible weight begins to loosen, another truth quietly rises to the surface. Sometimes the mind is not restless because it is overactive. Sometimes it is restless because something deeper still feels unsettled. The role may soften, the pressure may ease, but beneath all of that there can still remain a private ache. The feeling that something important inside has not fully come together. There are nights when the room is quiet, the lights are off, the body is tired, and still sleep does not come. Not because the mattress is wrong, not because the world is too loud, not because the body does not need rest, but because something in the inner life still feels unfinished. A question with no answer, a grief with no proper ending, a longing with no clear name, a life that keeps moving on the outside while some deeper part remains behind, waiting to be understood. This is one of the hardest forms of exhaustion to recognize. The body says it is tired, but the soul says it is still carrying something. And when those two are out of harmony, sleep becomes difficult. The eyes may close, but the whole being does not surrender. There is a quiet resistance, not always dramatic, not always obvious, but strong enough to keep the nervous system from fully letting go. Many people think sleeplessness is only about stress or bad habits. Sometimes that is true. But there is another layer that is rarely spoken about. A person can be kept awake by inner incompletion, by the sense that life has not yet been digested, that what has been lived has not yet been fully accepted, understood, or placed in its proper place. The body cannot rest deeply when the inner world still feels scattered. This unfinished feeling can come from many places. It can come from years spent chasing things that never satisfied the heart. It can come from choices that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. It can come from pain that was survived, but never truly processed. It can come from being so busy living that there was no time to ask what any of it meant. And at night, when distractions disappear, all of that begins to whisper. The Stoics understood something that modern life often ignores. A human being does not suffer only from events, but from the meaning left unresolved around those events. What disturbs us is not just what happened, but what we still cannot make peace with. A broken relationship, a lost dream, a version of life that never arrived, a part of the self that feels underused or unknown. These things do not always shout during the day. They wait for stillness. Then they return. This is why a person can be physically safe and still feel internally unsettled. The day may have ended, but the deeper questions have not. Have I lived honestly? Have I become who I was meant to become? Have I betrayed parts of myself just to be accepted? Have I forgiven what needed forgiving? Have I grieved what needed grieving? Have I built a life that my soul can actually rest inside? These are not small questions, and even when they are not spoken clearly, the body feels them. The chest tightens, the jaw hardens, the stomach stays alert, the breath becomes shallow. The body begins acting like it is waiting for something, because in a way it is. It is waiting for inner truth to be faced. The Stoic path does not ask you to solve your whole life in one night. It asks for something more realistic and more healing. It asks for honesty. It asks you to stop running from the quiet ache and instead sit beside it without panic. To stop demanding immediate closure and instead allow the unfinished parts of life to be seen clearly. This alone begins to change the body, because the body does not only respond to answers, it responds to sincerity. When you stop hiding from yourself, the nervous system notices. When you stop pretending everything is fine, something in you begins to trust the moment more. When you admit that some parts of your life still hurt, still confuse you, still feel incomplete, the inner war softens. There is less strain in being real than in constantly acting resolved. This is where Stoic reflection becomes deeply calming. Not because it removes all pain, but because it teaches you how to hold pain without becoming ruled by it. The Stoics believed that peace comes from aligning with reality, not escaping it. So if your soul feels unfinished, the answer is not to force sleep by overpowering the mind. The answer is to stop fighting the truth of where you actually are. There may be things in your life that are not complete, conversations that never happened, gifts that were never fully used, seasons that ended before you were ready, versions of yourself that still need compassion. This does not mean you have failed. It means you are human. Life rarely arrives in neat endings. Most people fall asleep in the middle of unresolved chapters. The trouble begins when they believe they should not. A great burden is lifted when you understand this. You do not need a perfectly finished life to deserve rest. You do not need complete certainty to let your body soften. You do not need to answer every question tonight. What you need is a gentler relationship with incompletion. A willingness to say, there are parts of me still unfolding, and I do not need to punish myself for that. This changes the whole tone of the night. Instead of treating sleeplessness like an enemy, you begin to listen to it like a signal. Not a punishment, not a flaw, a signal. Something in you wants integration. Something wants to be welcomed back into the whole. And that process starts not with pressure, but with quiet acceptance. So tonight, the invitation is simple. Let the unfinished be unfinished without turning it into fear. Let the unanswered be unanswered without making it a crisis. Let the soul be where it is, not where you think it should already be. Your life does not have to be fully resolved for your body to begin trusting the dark. It only has to feel that you are no longer abandoning yourself. And when that happens, even slightly, something shifts. The body no longer has to stay on guard. The breath becomes less guarded. The chest begins to open. The mind stops pressing for final answers. And in that softer space, sleep no longer feels like something that must be forced. It starts to feel like something you are finally allowed to receive. And as that quiet acceptance begins to settle, another pattern becomes easier to see. Not just what is unfinished, but how much energy is spent fighting what is already here. The struggle is not always with life itself, but with the refusal to let life be as it is, even for a moment. There is a tension many people carry without realizing it. It is not always loud. It does not always show on the outside, but inside it is constant. A quiet pushing away of thoughts, a tightening against emotions, a resistance to fatigue, a refusal to feel what is present. It feels like control, but it slowly becomes a kind of inner conflict. This is the hidden violence. Not violence toward others, but toward your own experience. It shows up when a thought appears and you immediately try to silence it, when sadness rises and you try to distract yourself out of it, when the body feels tired and you force it to keep going, when anxiety moves through you and you tell yourself it should not be there. Each of these moments seems small, almost harmless, but over time they create friction inside the mind and body, because every time you resist what is already present, you create a second layer of suffering. First, there is the original experience. Then, there is the fight against it. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that pain is often unavoidable, but the resistance to pain is what multiplies it. When you argue with what is already happening inside you, you divide yourself. One part of you is feeling, the other part is attacking that feeling. And in that division, tension grows. The body feels this immediately. The breath becomes shallow, the muscles tighten, the heart rate shifts. Not always in dramatic ways, but enough to keep the system alert, enough to keep the mind from settling, enough to make rest feel distant, even when you are lying still. This is why some people feel exhausted but cannot relax, because they are not only carrying their thoughts and emotions, they are also carrying the effort of trying to control them. It is like holding water in a clenched fist. The tighter you squeeze, the more energy you use, and the less effective it becomes. But something inside keeps saying, hold it tighter, control it better, do not let it slip. And so the cycle continues. But there is another way to meet what arises. The Stoic approach does not tell you to remove thoughts. It does not tell you to eliminate emotions. It does not demand that you become perfectly calm before you can rest. Instead, it offers something far more powerful. It teaches you how to stop fighting. When a thought appears, you do not chase it, but you also do not push it away. You let it pass through your awareness like a cloud moving across the sky. It comes, it exists, and it moves on. You do not need to solve it. You do not need to react to it. You simply see it. When an emotion rises, you allow space for it, not by feeding it with stories, but by not denying its presence. You let it be felt in the body without turning it into a problem that must be fixed immediately. When the body feels tired, you listen instead of resisting. You soften instead of forcing. You allow the natural signals of the body to guide you back to stillness. This is not weakness. This is alignment. Because the moment you stop fighting your own inner experience, the nervous system begins to shift. It no longer needs to stay on high alert. It no longer interprets your own thoughts and feelings as threats. It begins to trust that what arises will not be attacked. And that trust changes everything. The breath deepens naturally. The muscles release without effort. The mind becomes quieter, not because it is forced, but because it is no longer being stirred by resistance. This is the beginning of real restoration. Not through control, but through allowing. There is a common fear that if you stop resisting, everything will become overwhelming. That thoughts will take over, that emotions will drown you. But the opposite is often true. It is the resistance that keeps things stuck. It is the pushing away that gives thoughts their intensity. When you stop feeding the struggle, what you feared begins to lose its grip. A thought that is not resisted fades faster. An emotion that is not judged softens sooner. A feeling that is not fought moves through instead of staying trapped. This is the quiet intelligence of the mind and body. They are not trying to harm you. They are trying to process, to release, to balance. But they can only do that when they are not being blocked by constant interference. So tonight, there is nothing you need to force, nothing you need to control. If a thought comes, let it come. If a feeling rises, let it rise. If the body shifts, let it shift. You are not here to manage every detail of your inner world. You are here to stop turning it into a battlefield. Because the moment the battle ends, even slightly, peace does not need to be created. It is already there, waiting underneath the struggle. This is the doorway out of tension, the doorway out of constant mental effort, the doorway into a deeper kind of rest. And as you continue to release the habit of resistance, the mind becomes less sharp, less rigid. The body becomes less guarded. The whole system begins to settle into something more natural, not perfect calm, but honest calm. The kind that does not come from forcing silence, but from no longer fighting the noise. And as the struggle begins to loosen, something even deeper becomes visible. Not just the resistance to thoughts or feelings, but the quiet belief behind it all. The belief that rest must be earned, that peace must be deserved. That before the body is allowed to soften, everything inside must first be solved, corrected, or understood. This belief is so common that it almost feels normal. There is a silent rule many people live by. I will rest when this is figured out. I will relax when this problem is gone. I will finally let go when everything is in order. And so the mind keeps working, searching, fixing, rearranging, trying to bring life into a perfect state before allowing even a moment of stillness. But that moment rarely comes. Because life does not arrive in a finished form. There is always something left open, something unclear, something that could be improved, explained, or controlled better. And if rest depends on total resolution, then rest keeps getting delayed. Not for a day, not for a week, but for years. This is where a different kind of exhaustion begins. Not from effort alone, but from postponing peace. The body feels it. It waits for permission to soften, but the mind keeps holding that permission back. It keeps saying, not yet. It keeps scanning for what is still incomplete. It keeps tightening around what feels uncertain. And in that constant state of almost ready, the nervous system never fully settles. Even when the body lies still, it does not feel safe to let go. The Stoics understood this pattern in a very direct way. They saw that the desire for control often disguises itself as responsibility. It feels wise, it feels necessary, but when taken too far, it becomes a trap, because it convinces the mind that peace must come after everything is managed. But peace does not come after control. It comes after releasing the need for it. This does not mean giving up on life. It does not mean ignoring what matters. It means recognizing a simple truth. Not everything can be fixed tonight. Not everything can be understood in one moment. And not everything needs to be controlled for the body to begin resting. When you wait for perfect conditions, you create endless delay. When you allow imperfect conditions, you create space. This is where the shift begins. Instead of asking, what still needs to be solved, you begin to ask, what can I allow to be as it is, just for now? This question changes the whole tone of the mind. It removes urgency, it softens pressure, it opens a small doorway where rest can enter, even if nothing is fully resolved. At first, the mind may resist this. It may say, but this is important. It may say, you cannot just leave things unfinished. It may say, if you let go, things will fall apart. But notice that voice. It is not speaking from peace. It is speaking from fear, from habit, from years of believing that control equals safety. And yet, even with all that control, the body is still tired. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes grounding. It reminds you that your role is not to control every outcome. Your role is to respond with clarity and then allow what is outside your reach to remain outside your grip. Some things belong to you, your actions, your choices, your effort, but many things do not. Other people's thoughts, the final results, the full unfolding of events. When the mind tries to take ownership of everything, it becomes overloaded. It carries more than it was designed to carry, and that overload is what prevents rest. So tonight, the practice is not to fix the mind, it is to release its burden. Let the unanswered questions stay unanswered for now. Let the incomplete parts of the day remain incomplete. Let the uncertainty exist without forcing it into clarity. This is not neglect. This is wisdom. Because the body does not need a perfect life to rest. It needs a signal of safety. And safety does not come from having everything under control. It comes from knowing that you do not have to hold everything at once. There is a quiet strength in saying, this is enough for today. Not as a statement of defeat, but as a boundary. A gentle closing of the door on effort. A recognition that the mind has done what it can, and the rest does not need to be carried into the night. When this boundary is set, something begins to shift inside. The shoulders drop slightly. The breath slows without being forced. The thoughts lose some of their urgency. The body starts to understand that it is no longer being asked to stay alert for unfinished tasks, and in that understanding it begins to soften. This is where real rest begins, not after everything is fixed, but in the middle of what is still unfolding. You do not need to earn this moment. You do not need to solve your entire life before allowing yourself to feel calm. You only need to stop delaying the permission to rest. Because the more you wait for the perfect time to relax, the more the mind learns that peace is something distant, something conditional, something that always comes later. But it does not have to be that way. Peace can begin here, in this breath, in this moment where nothing is being fixed, nothing is being forced, and nothing is being carried beyond what is necessary. And as you allow that to be enough, even just a little, the body receives the message it has been waiting for. It is safe to let go, not forever, just for now, and for now. That is enough. And as the body begins to accept that not everything needs to be solved, another hidden weight starts to reveal itself. A quieter one, a deeper one. Not just the need to fix things, but the belief that everything depends on you. There is a heaviness that shows up at night that does not come from the day's work. It comes from the roles carried in silence. The feeling that if something goes wrong, it will somehow be your fault. The quiet pressure to hold everything together, to think ahead, to protect others, to make sure nothing falls apart. It does not always sound loud in the mind. Sometimes it is just a feeling, a constant readiness, a sense that you cannot fully relax because something might need you at any moment. This is the burden of over-responsibility. It grows slowly, often from good intentions, from caring deeply, from wanting to do the right thing, from being reliable, from being the one people can count on. But over time, something shifts. Responsibility turns into control, care turns into pressure, and without noticing, the mind begins to carry things that were never meant to belong to it. At night, when everything becomes still, this burden becomes clearer. The mind begins to scan for problems. It replays situations, looking for what could go wrong. It tries to prepare for outcomes that have not even happened. It feels responsible for how others feel, what others choose, and how everything might unfold. And because none of this can be fully controlled, the mind stays active. It keeps searching for certainty where there is none. This is why the body cannot rest, because it feels like it is on duty. Even in silence, even in darkness, even when nothing is actually happening, the system stays alert, as if it is guarding something, as if it must remain ready to step in, fix, prevent, or rescue. The Stoics understood this pattern deeply. They saw that much of human anxiety comes from confusing what belongs to us with what does not. When the mind takes ownership of outcomes, of other people's actions, of future events, it becomes overwhelmed. Not because it is weak, but because it is trying to carry what cannot be carried. There is a clear boundary that often gets blurred. What belongs to you is your effort, your choices, your response. What does not belong to you is the final outcome, the reactions of others, the unfolding of events beyond your control. When this boundary is forgotten, the mind begins to stretch beyond its natural limits. It tries to manage everything, and in doing so, it loses its ability to rest. This overextension is what creates the heaviness. It is like holding a weight that keeps increasing, without realizing that you are allowed to put it down. The longer it is held, the more natural it feels, until one day, the idea of releasing it feels almost wrong. The mind may say, if I let go, something bad will happen. It may say, if I stop thinking about this, I am being careless. It may say, if I do not carry this, who will? But these thoughts come from fear, not from truth, because the truth is simple, even if it feels difficult to accept. You are not responsible for everything. You are not responsible for controlling every outcome. You are not responsible for fixing every situation. You are not responsible for preventing every possible failure. There are limits to what you can influence, and those limits are not a weakness. They are part of the design of life. The Stoic path invites you to see those limits clearly, not to resist them, but to respect them, to understand that carrying more than what belongs to you does not make you stronger. It only makes you more exhausted. When this understanding begins to settle, something changes. The mind no longer needs to monitor everything. The body no longer needs to stay in constant readiness. The breath begins to move more freely. There is space again. But this space does not come from forcing yourself to stop caring. It comes from changing how you care. Instead of carrying outcomes, you focus on your actions. Instead of trying to control everything, you respond to what is in front of you. Instead of predicting every problem, you trust your ability to handle what comes when it comes. This is a different kind of strength, a quieter one. It does not need constant effort. It does not need endless thinking. It simply knows where its role begins and where it ends. And at night, this clarity becomes a form of relief. You can let the day be finished. You can allow others to walk their own path. You can release the future from your grip. Not because you do not care, but because you understand that caring does not require carrying everything. There is a deep calm in this realization, the kind that does not come from solving every problem, but from stepping back into your rightful place within life. A place where you do what you can and you release what you cannot. And as this becomes clearer, the body begins to trust the moment more. It no longer feels like it must stay alert for things outside its reach. It no longer holds tension for outcomes it cannot control. It begins to settle into stillness. This is where the heaviness starts to lift. Not all at once, but enough for the breath to deepen. Enough for the muscles to soften. Enough for the mind to quiet down just a little more. And in that softening, something important becomes possible again. Rest, not as an escape, but as a natural result of no longer carrying what was never yours to hold. And as that weight of over-responsibility begins to fall away, another layer quietly reveals itself beneath it. Not just the habit of carrying too much, but the deeper reason why it was being carried in the first place. There is a subtle fear that often hides behind constant thinking, a fear that is not always spoken clearly, but felt deeply. It is not really a fear of problems. It is not even a fear of the future itself. It is a fear of not being in control of what might happen. There is something about sleep that makes this fear rise to the surface, because sleep asks for something that the anxious mind struggles to give. Surrender. Not the kind of surrender that feels like defeat, but the kind that requires letting go of control completely. When you sleep, you are no longer managing your thoughts. You are no longer monitoring your surroundings. You are no longer preparing, predicting, or protecting. You are simply not in charge for a while, and for a mind that has learned to stay alert, this can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. So instead of resting, the mind stays active. It keeps thinking. It keeps scanning. It keeps holding on to awareness as if letting go would be unsafe, not because it wants to suffer, but because it believes that staying in control is what keeps everything together. This is why many people do not actually fear sleep. They fear what sleep requires, the release of control. During the day, control can feel useful. It helps with planning. It helps with decision-making. It creates a sense of order. But when it becomes excessive, it turns into tension. The mind begins to treat uncertainty as danger. It begins to believe that if it is not constantly thinking, something will be missed. And so, even when the body is tired, the mind refuses to fully step back. It stays in a state of readiness, ready to think, ready to react, ready to solve. But this readiness comes at a cost. The nervous system remains active. The breath stays shallow. The body holds a quiet tension, and in this state, sleep becomes difficult, not because the body does not need it, but because the mind does not feel safe enough to let go. The Stoics saw this pattern with clarity. They understood that the desire for control often comes from a misunderstanding of what can actually be controlled. When the mind tries to hold everything, it creates a constant sense of pressure. But the truth is simple. You were never in full control to begin with. Not of every outcome. Not of every event. Not of every possibility. And yet, life has continued. This is not something to fear. It is something to recognize. Because when you see that control has always been partial, never complete, something begins to shift. The need to hold everything starts to loosen. The pressure to manage every detail begins to soften, and this is where the doorway to rest begins to open. Instead of trying to control sleep, you begin to allow it. Instead of forcing the mind to stop, you begin to step back from it. Instead of holding on to awareness tightly, you begin to trust that it is okay to release it for a while. This trust is not built in a single moment. It grows slowly. It grows when you remind yourself that you have handled uncertainty before. It grows when you see that not everything needs your constant attention. It grows when you allow small moments of letting go during the day. Because surrender is not something that suddenly happens at night. It is something that is practiced in small ways over time. When you allow a thought to pass without controlling it, that is surrender. When you accept that you cannot predict everything, that is surrender. When you let a moment be incomplete without rushing to fix it, that is surrender. These small acts begin to teach the mind that letting go is not dangerous. And once the mind starts to learn this, the body follows. The breath becomes deeper without effort. The muscles begin to release. The inner urgency starts to fade. There is less need to stay on guard. And in that softer state, sleep begins to feel different. Not something you have to achieve, but something that naturally arrives when you are no longer holding on so tightly. There is a quiet shift that happens here. You stop asking, "How do I make myself sleep?" and you begin asking, "What am I still holding on to?" Because often it is not the absence of sleep that is the problem. It is the presence of control. And when that control begins to loosen, even slightly, the mind becomes less rigid. The body becomes more at ease. The whole system starts to move toward stillness. This is not about losing yourself. It is about allowing yourself to rest from constantly managing everything. You do not disappear when you sleep. You return. You return to a state where the mind is not carrying the weight of control, where the body is not bracing against uncertainty, where the whole system is allowed to reset without interference. So tonight, there is nothing you need to force, nothing you need to control. If the mind wants to think, let it think. If the body wants to shift, let it shift. And slowly, gently, begin to loosen your grip. Not all at once, just a little. Because even a small release of control is enough to send a message through the body. It is safe to let go. And in that safety, sleep no longer feels like something you must chase. It becomes something that finds you when you are finally ready to release what you were never meant to hold all night. And as that grip on control begins to soften, another layer of tiredness starts to make sense. Not just the tiredness of the body, but a deeper kind that sleep alone does not seem to touch. There are mornings when the body has technically rested, but something inside still feels heavy. The eyes may have been closed for hours, the body may have stayed still, and yet the moment the day begins, there is a quiet drain already present, a sense that energy is low before anything has even started. This is where many people become confused. Because they assume all tiredness is the same, they believe that more sleep should fix it, that a longer night should bring more strength. But when it does not, frustration begins. Questions begin. Why am I still tired? What is wrong with me? Why does rest not feel like rest? The answer is not always found in the body. Because not all fatigue comes from the body. There is a difference between physical fatigue and something deeper. Physical fatigue is simple. It comes from movement, effort, activity. The muscles work, the body uses energy, and rest restores it. When this kind of tiredness is present, sleep usually helps. The body recovers and energy returns. But existential fatigue is different. It does not come from what you do. It comes from what you carry inside. It comes from meaning that feels unclear, from direction that feels uncertain, from living in a way that does not fully align with something deeper within you. It is a quiet weight that does not always have a clear cause, but is felt strongly in the background of daily life. This kind of fatigue cannot be fixed by sleeping longer, because the body is not the source of it. The Stoics understood that human beings do not only need rest from action, they need alignment with meaning. When a person's inner world feels disconnected from how they are living, a subtle exhaustion begins to grow. It may not be obvious at first. The days continue, responsibilities are handled, life moves forward. But underneath, there is a quiet question that doesn't fully go away. Why does this feel so heavy? This question is not asking for more sleep. It is asking for clarity. Existential fatigue often shows up in small ways. A lack of excitement, even when things are going well. A sense of dullness, even after resting. A feeling that something is missing, but without knowing exactly what. It is not dramatic. It is subtle, but it lingers. And because it does not have a clear physical cause, many people try to treat it like physical fatigue. They rest more, they take breaks, they try to recover through the body, but the deeper layer remains untouched. This is why a person can sleep for many hours and still wake up feeling drained, because the body rested, but the inner world did not. The Stoic approach to this kind of fatigue is not to force energy back into the body. It is to gently examine the direction of the inner life, not with pressure, not with harsh judgment, but with quiet honesty. Are you living in a way that feels true to you? Are your actions connected to something meaningful? Are you spending your energy on what actually matters to you? These are not questions that need immediate answers, but they are questions that deserve attention, because when these areas are ignored, the mind begins to feel scattered, the energy begins to feel misused, and over time, this creates a deep kind of tiredness that no amount of sleep can fully repair. There is also another layer to this. Existential fatigue often grows when a person is constantly doing without reflecting, moving without pausing, acting without reconnecting to why they are acting at all. Life becomes a series of tasks, not a connected experience. And when meaning becomes distant, energy follows. The Stoics believed that clarity of purpose brings a kind of inner strength that goes beyond physical energy. When a person knows why they are doing something, the effort feels lighter. The mind feels more stable. The body feels more supported. But when that clarity is missing, even small efforts can feel draining. This is why rest must go beyond the body. It must also reach the mind, not by forcing answers, but by creating space for understanding. Sometimes the most restorative thing is not more sleep. It is a moment of honesty. A moment where you stop moving, stop distracting, and simply notice what feels out of place. Not to fix it immediately, but to acknowledge it, to bring it into awareness instead of letting it stay hidden. Because what is unseen often continues to drain energy quietly, but what is seen begins to shift. This does not mean you need to change your entire life overnight. It means you begin to reconnect with yourself in small ways. You notice what feels meaningful. You notice what feels empty. You notice where your energy flows easily and where it feels forced. This awareness begins to guide you back toward alignment. And as that alignment grows, something interesting happens. Energy starts to return, not because you forced it, but because you are no longer spending it in ways that feel disconnected. The body begins to feel lighter. The mind feels less scattered. The sense of heaviness begins to fade. This is not instant. It is gradual, but it is real, and it goes deeper than physical rest. So tonight, if there is tiredness, let it be seen clearly. If it is physical, allow the body to rest. If it is deeper, do not rush to fix it. Simply acknowledge it. Because not all fatigue needs more sleep. Some fatigue needs understanding. And as that understanding begins to grow, even slightly, the kind of rest you experience begins to change. It becomes more complete, more grounded, more connected. Not just a break for the body, but a quiet restoration for the whole self. And as that deeper tiredness begins to make sense, another pattern slowly comes into focus. Not just the feeling of being drained, but the way the mind keeps moving forward, even when the body is trying to stay still. There is a quiet habit many people carry into the night. The body lies down, but the mind steps into tomorrow. A strange pull begins as soon as the day ends. Thoughts start lining up. Plans begin forming. Conversations are rehearsed. Outcomes are imagined. Problems that have not even happened yet are examined as if they are already real. It feels productive. It feels responsible. It feels like preparation. But in reality, it is something else. It is the mind trying to outthink uncertainty. There is a subtle belief behind this habit. A belief that if you can think far enough ahead, clearly enough and thoroughly enough, you can prevent what might go wrong. That if you rehearse tomorrow enough times in your head, you will somehow arrive more prepared, more protected, and more in control. So the mind begins its work. It asks, what if this happens? Then, what should I say? Then, what could go wrong? And before you notice it, the present moment disappears. The body is in bed, but the mind is already living through a version of tomorrow that has not even arrived. The Stoics recognized this pattern long ago. They saw that the human mind has a tendency to leave the present in search of certainty. Not because the present is always painful, but because the future feels unpredictable. And unpredictability feels unsafe. So the mind tries to solve it. But here is the truth that often gets missed. You cannot solve what has not happened. You can only imagine it. And imagination, when used this way, does not create clarity. It creates endless loops. For every imagined solution, another imagined problem appears. For every prepared answer, another possible outcome shows up. The mind keeps building scenarios, but none of them are real enough to bring true resolution. So the process continues, and the body stays awake. Not because it needs to be, but because the mind will not return. This is the psychological trap. The more you try to prepare for tomorrow in your head, the further you move away from the only place where rest is possible. The present. The Stoic approach to this is not to stop thinking completely. It is to recognize the limits of thinking. To see clearly where thought is useful and where it becomes unnecessary. Planning has its place. But there is a point where planning turns into rehearsing, and rehearsing turns into worrying, and worrying turns into tension. The difference is subtle, but important. Planning happens with clarity and then ends. Rehearsing repeats without closure. When the mind is rehearsing, it is not actually preparing. It is looping, trying to feel safe through repetition, trying to gain certainty through imagination. But certainty does not come from thinking about tomorrow. It comes from trusting your ability to meet it when it arrives. This is where the Stoic shift happens. Instead of asking, "Have I thought about this enough?" you begin to ask, "Do I trust myself enough to handle it when it comes?" This question changes everything, because it brings the focus back to you, not to the imagined future. It reminds you that you do not need to live tomorrow in advance. You only need to be ready to meet it when it becomes real. This does not mean ignoring what matters. It means knowing when enough is enough. There is a point where further thinking adds no value. Only tension, only restlessness, only distance from the present moment. And the present moment is where the body is trying to rest. So tonight, the practice is simple. When the mind begins to move into tomorrow, notice it. Do not fight it. Do not follow it. Just see it. See how it builds scenarios. See how it searches for certainty. See how it repeats the same loops. And then gently bring your attention back. Back to the breath. Back to the feeling of the body lying down. Back to the reality of this moment, where nothing is actually happening. This return is not forceful. It is soft, because the goal is not to control the mind. It is to stop feeding the habit of leaving the present. Each time you return, even briefly, you are teaching the mind something new. You are showing it that safety is not found in thinking ahead. It is found in being here. And as this becomes clearer, the urge to rehearse begins to lose its intensity. Not all at once, but gradually. The mind becomes less interested in chasing future scenarios. The body begins to feel less pulled. The whole system starts to settle. Because the pressure to figure out tomorrow has been released. There is nothing you need to solve right now. Nothing you need to prepare in this moment. Tomorrow will arrive on its own, and when it does, you will meet it with the same awareness you have now. So there is no need to live it twice. Once in your mind, and once in reality. One is enough. And as you begin to trust that, even slightly, the mind no longer feels the need to run ahead. It begins to slow down, to return, to rest. Right here, where sleep is not blocked by imagined futures, but welcomed by a mind that is finally willing to stay. And as the mind slowly learns to stop running ahead into tomorrow, another quieter habit begins to reveal itself. Not the habit of thinking about the future, but the habit of constantly watching yourself in the present. There is a subtle tension that comes from always being aware of yourself, but not in a peaceful way. A kind of inner monitoring that never turns off. A quiet voice that keeps asking, am I doing this right? Am I reacting correctly? Am I feeling what I should be feeling? It sounds like awareness, but it is not the kind that brings peace. It is the kind that creates pressure. There are people who do not rest because they are not only living, they are also observing themselves living at the same time. Every action is checked. Every emotion is analyzed. Every thought is judged. It is like being both the actor and the critic at the same time. And the critic never leaves. During the day, this can feel like control, like being careful, like being self-aware. But at night, when everything becomes quiet, this habit becomes exhausting, because there is no break from yourself. Even in stillness, the mind keeps watching. It looks at how you are breathing. It notices how you are lying down. It questions whether you are relaxed enough. It checks if your thoughts are calm enough. And the more it watches, the more unnatural everything feels. The breath becomes forced. The body becomes tense. The mind becomes sharper instead of softer. This is the inner cost of constant self-observation. Instead of allowing experience to flow, the mind interferes with it. It turns simple moments into something that must be managed. It turns natural feelings into something that must be evaluated. And over time, this creates fragmentation. One part of you is living. Another part of you is watching. Another part of you is judging what is being watched. This division may not be obvious at first, but it slowly pulls you away from a sense of wholeness. You are no longer simply present. You are split into layers of control and evaluation. The Stoics had a very different understanding of awareness. They did not teach people to constantly analyze themselves. They taught people to notice without attachment, to observe without turning every moment into a problem. Because true awareness is quiet, it does not interfere. It does not judge every detail. It simply sees what is there and allows it to be. This is the difference. Constant self-observation is tense and controlling. Stoic awareness is calm and spacious. When you are constantly watching yourself, you are trying to improve every moment. But when you are simply aware, you are allowing each moment to unfold naturally. This shift is subtle but powerful. It means you do not need to check if you are relaxed. You just let the body relax. You do not need to analyze every thought. You just let thoughts pass. You do not need to monitor your emotions. You just allow them to move without interference. At first, this can feel unfamiliar, because the mind is used to being involved in everything. It is used to managing, correcting, adjusting. It believes that if it stops watching, something will go wrong. But notice this carefully. Has all that watching brought peace? Or has it created more tension? Because the truth is, constant self-observation does not create calm. It creates pressure. It makes you feel like you are always on display, even when you are alone. It turns your own mind into a place where you are never fully at ease. This is why rest becomes difficult. Because rest requires a certain kind of trust. Trust that you do not need to manage every moment. Trust that the body knows how to soften on its own. Trust that the mind does not need to be controlled every second. When this trust is missing, the mind keeps watching. But when this trust begins to grow, something changes. The need to monitor begins to fade. You start to notice moments where you are simply present, without thinking about how you are being present. The breath flows more naturally. The body settles without effort. The mind becomes less sharp, less tense. There is less division, more wholeness. This is where real rest begins to deepen, not by trying to perfect your inner state, but by stepping back from the constant need to evaluate it. So tonight, there is nothing you need to check, nothing you need to improve, nothing you need to monitor. If the body feels tense, let it be tense for a moment. If the mind feels active, let it be active. You do not need to watch it closely. You do not need to judge it. You do not need to fix it. Just allow yourself to exist without commentary. This may feel strange at first, but within that space, something begins to open. A quiet ease, a sense that you are no longer split between doing and watching. You are simply here, and in that simplicity, the mind becomes less crowded, the body becomes less guarded, and rest becomes something that is no longer controlled, but something that gently unfolds when you stop watching yourself so closely. And as that constant self-watching begins to soften, another quiet pressure comes into view. Not just the need to observe yourself, but the need to manage everything about your life so precisely that nothing is left uncertain. There is a silent fantasy many people carry without realizing it. The idea that life can be perfectly organized, perfectly timed, perfectly controlled. That if you plan well enough, think carefully enough, and act correctly enough, everything will fall into place exactly as it should. It sounds responsible. It sounds intelligent. But underneath it, there is tension. Because life does not move in straight lines. There are moments that do not fit the plan. People who do not behave as expected. Outcomes that shift without warning. And when the mind is attached to the idea of a perfectly managed life, every unexpected turn feels like a disruption. So the mind works harder. It tries to plan further ahead. It tries to predict more variables. It tries to tighten control over what is uncertain. But the more it tries to control everything, the more fragile everything begins to feel. Because perfection cannot hold in a world that is constantly changing. This is where the invisible stress begins. Not from what is happening, but from the gap between what is happening and what you believe should be happening. You may not say it out loud, but the pressure is there. Things should be clearer. Things should be more stable. Things should be more certain. And when they are not, the mind becomes restless. It searches for ways to fix the situation, to bring it back into alignment with the imagined plan. But the plan itself was never fully real. It was an idea, a structure created to feel safe in a world that cannot be fully structured. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that trying to control the entire shape of life creates more suffering than uncertainty itself, because it places the mind in a constant state of correction, always adjusting, always refining, always trying to bring reality closer to expectation. But reality does not follow expectation. And when you resist that truth, tension grows. This is why perfectionism feels exhausting. It is not just about doing things well. It is about trying to eliminate all unpredictability, and that is something the mind cannot achieve. There will always be parts of life that remain open, unclear, unfinished. But instead of seeing this as a flaw, the Stoics saw it as part of the natural order. Life is not meant to be fully written in advance. It is meant to unfold. And when you allow it to unfold, something begins to shift inside you. The need to control every detail starts to loosen. The pressure to get everything exactly right begins to fade. You begin to see that not everything needs to be planned for it to work out. Not everything needs to be perfect for it to be meaningful. There is a quiet freedom in this, a freedom that does not come from having everything in place, but from no longer needing everything to be in place. At first, this can feel uncomfortable, because the mind is used to structure, used to planning, used to holding a clear image of how things should go. Letting go of that image can feel like stepping into uncertainty. But notice something important. You are already living in uncertainty. Even with all the planning, all the preparation, all the effort to manage everything, there has always been an unknown ahead. And yet, you have continued. You have responded. You have adapted. You have moved forward, even when things did not go as expected. This is where trust begins to grow. Not trust that everything will go perfectly, but trust that you can meet what comes, even when it is not planned. This trust is what replaces the need for perfection. It allows the mind to rest without needing every detail to be resolved. It allows the body to soften without waiting for everything to be certain, because the pressure to manage life completely has been released. There is no longer a need to control the entire path, only to walk the part that is in front of you. So tonight, there is nothing you need to organize perfectly, nothing you need to finalize, nothing you need to bring into complete clarity. Let parts of your life remain unwritten. Let some questions stay open. Let the future exist without needing to shape it into a fixed plan. This is not carelessness. This is alignment with how life actually works. Because life is not a script you must complete before you can rest. It is a process you move through moment by moment. And when you stop trying to finalize it, something inside you begins to ease. The shoulders drop a little more. The breath becomes less controlled. The mind becomes less rigid. There is space again. Space for uncertainty. Space for change. Space for life to move without being forced into a perfect shape. And in that space, rest becomes possible. Not because everything is settled, but because you are no longer demanding that it be. You are simply allowing life to remain open. And in that openness, there is a quiet kind of peace, the kind that does not depend on perfection, the kind that allows you to rest, even while the story of your life is still being written. And as the need to control and perfect life begins to loosen, something deeper starts to surface, not from the future, not from planning, but from what was quietly pushed away during the day. There are feelings that do not disappear just because they were ignored. They wait. They move beneath the surface. They stay in the body. They remain unfinished. And when the world becomes quiet, when the distractions fall away, when there is finally space, they return. Not loudly at first, but enough to disturb the stillness. There is a kind of restlessness that does not come from thinking too much about the future. It comes from something older, something that was felt but not fully allowed. A moment of sadness that was brushed aside, a flash of anger that was swallowed, a disappointment that was quickly covered with, "It's fine." During the day, this can feel necessary. You move through responsibilities. You keep things together. You avoid slowing down long enough to feel everything fully. And in doing so, it seems like you are managing your emotions well. But what is pushed down does not dissolve. It stays. The Stoics did not teach suppression. They taught understanding. They taught that emotions are signals, not enemies. That they arise for a reason, and that ignoring them does not remove their influence. It only delays their expression. So at night, when there is nothing left to hold them down, they rise again. Not always as clear emotions, but as agitation, as thoughts that keep repeating without clear meaning, as tension in the body that has no obvious cause, as a heaviness that feels difficult to explain, as a sense that something is unsettled, even when everything around you is quiet. This is the return of what was not allowed. It is not a failure. It is a process. The body and mind are trying to complete something that was left incomplete. But when this happens, many people respond in the same way they did during the day. They resist it. They try to push the feelings away again. They distract themselves with more thoughts. They become frustrated that they cannot relax. And in doing so, they repeat the same cycle. Suppression followed by agitation. Agitation followed by more suppression. And the loop continues. The Stoic approach invites something different. Not control, not avoidance, but permission. Permission to feel without turning it into a problem. When a feeling begins to surface, the goal is not to analyze it immediately, not to explain it, not to judge whether it is valid or not. The goal is to allow it to exist. If there is sadness, let it be there without pushing it away. If there is tension, notice it without trying to remove it instantly. If there is a heaviness, stay with it without labeling it as something that should not be happening. This may feel uncomfortable at first, because the mind is used to fixing, solving, and controlling. But emotions do not need to be fixed in the same way thoughts do. They need to be felt, because feeling is what allows them to move. When an emotion is fully allowed, without resistance, without judgment, without interruption, it begins to change on its own. It does not stay stuck in the same way. It does not keep returning with the same intensity. But when it is denied, it becomes persistent. It keeps knocking. It keeps returning in different forms, sometimes as thoughts, sometimes as physical tension, sometimes as a vague discomfort that is hard to explain. This is why nighttime agitation can feel so confusing, because it is not always clear what is causing it. But often it is not something new. It is something that was already there, just not fully felt. The body remembers what the mind avoids. It carries what was not expressed, and when there is finally space, it tries to release it. This is not something to fear. It is something to understand, because once you see this pattern, the response begins to change. Instead of resisting what comes up at night, you begin to meet it with openness. You stop asking, "Why is this happening?" with frustration, and you begin to ask, "What is asking to be felt right now?" with curiosity. This shift removes pressure. It turns agitation into information. It allows the experience to unfold instead of being blocked. And as this happens, the intensity begins to soften, not instantly, but gradually. The body begins to release tension without force. The mind becomes less crowded with repetitive thoughts. The feeling that something is stuck begins to ease, because what needed to move is finally being allowed to move. So tonight, if something rises, let it rise. Not as a problem to solve, but as a part of you that was waiting for space. You do not need to push it away. You do not need to rush to understand it. You only need to let it exist without resistance. And in that simple act, something begins to change. The loop starts to break. The tension starts to soften. The agitation begins to lose its hold. And slowly, the body begins to feel safe again. Not because everything is perfect, but because nothing inside you is being denied anymore. And when nothing is being denied, rest no longer feels blocked. It begins to return quietly, as the body realizes it no longer has to carry what was never meant to be held in silence. And as those unexpressed feelings begin to move, another layer quietly reveals itself. Not just emotions returning, but something even deeper. The body itself holding on to moments that the mind believes are already over. There are reactions that do not match the present moment. A sudden tension in the chest, a quick tightening in the stomach, a subtle alertness that appears without a clear reason. Nothing dangerous is happening now, and yet the body responds as if something still is. This is not confusion. This is memory, but not the kind stored in thoughts, the kind stored in the nervous system. There are experiences the body does not forget, even when the mind has moved on. Moments of fear, stress, pressure, or uncertainty that were never fully settled. At the time, the body prepared itself to react. It tightened. It became alert. It got ready to protect. But when the moment passed, that readiness did not always complete its cycle. It stayed, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, stored in patterns, in posture, in breathing, in how quickly the system moves into alertness. The Stoics spoke often about the mind, but they also understood the body's role in how we experience life. They knew that peace is not only an idea, it is something that must be felt, because a person can understand that they are safe and still not feel safe. This is where many people become frustrated. They tell themselves there is nothing to worry about. They try to think their way into calm. They remind themselves that the past is over, but the body does not respond to logic alone. It responds to sensation, to patterns, to what it has learned through experience. So even when the mind is ready to let go, the body may still hold on. This is the nervous system remembering unfinished fear, not because it wants to keep you stuck, but because it never received the signal that it was safe to fully release. Think of it like this. When the body enters a state of alertness, it prepares for action. It gathers energy. It becomes focused. It gets ready to move, to respond, to protect. But if that response is interrupted, if the situation ends without the body completing its natural release, that energy remains. It does not disappear. It stays in the system, and later, in quiet moments, it shows up again. Not as a clear memory, but as tension, as restlessness, as a feeling that something is not fully settled. This is why some people feel uneasy, even in calm environments. Why stillness can feel uncomfortable. Why relaxation can take time. Because the body is still holding on to a signal that says, stay ready. The Stoic path does not ignore this. It does not try to override it with force. It works with it. By bringing attention back to the body, not just to the mind. Because true peace is not only about understanding, it is about experiencing safety. And safety must be felt physically. This begins with simple awareness, noticing how the body feels without trying to change it immediately. Noticing where tension sits, where the breath is tight, where the system feels slightly on edge. This is not about fixing anything, it is about reconnecting. Because when you bring gentle awareness to the body, you begin to create a new experience. An experience where the body is not being pushed, not being ignored, not being forced into calm, but being allowed. And in that allowance, something begins to shift. The breath slowly deepens. The muscles begin to soften. The nervous system starts to recognize that the present moment is different from the past. This is how the body learns safety again. Not through words, but through repeated experience. Each time you allow the body to settle without forcing it, you are teaching it something new. That it does not need to stay in a constant state of readiness. That it is okay to release. That the moment it is in now is not the same as the one it remembers. This process takes patience, because the body moves at a different pace than the mind. The mind can understand something instantly. The body needs repetition. It needs time to trust. But with each moment of gentle awareness, that trust grows. The system begins to recalibrate. The old patterns of tension begin to loosen. The stored energy begins to release, not all at once, but little by little. This is where real restoration begins, not just in thought, but in sensation, in the way the body feels when it is no longer holding on to past signals of danger. So tonight, there is nothing you need to prove to yourself, nothing you need to convince yourself of. If the body feels tense, let it be tense for a moment. If the breath feels shallow, simply notice it. If there is a sense of alertness, do not push it away. Just stay with it, gently, without pressure, because the goal is not to force the body into peace. It is to create the conditions where peace can naturally return. And as you stay with the body in this way, something begins to change. The system starts to recognize that it is not being rushed, not being judged, not being ignored. And in that recognition, it begins to let go. The memory of fear does not need to disappear instantly. It only needs to be met with something different, something calmer, something steadier, something that tells the body, without words, that it is safe to release what it has been holding. And as that message begins to settle, the tension softens, the breath deepens, the body becomes quieter. Not because the past has been erased, but because the present is finally being felt as it truly is, safe enough to rest. And that is where the deepest kind of sleep begins to unfold. And as the body begins to relearn what safety feels like, another pattern becomes clearer. Not just tension stored from the past, but the constant sense that something must be handled right now. There is a quiet pressure many people carry without questioning it, a feeling that everything is urgent, that every thought needs attention, that every feeling must be resolved quickly. Even when nothing is happening, the mind moves as if something is about to go wrong. This is the tyranny of inner urgency. It does not shout, it pushes, it shows up as a subtle rush in the mind, a need to respond immediately, a discomfort with stillness, a feeling that if you slow down, you might miss something important. So the mind speeds up. It jumps from one thought to another. It tries to process everything at once. It refuses to stay in a single moment for too long. And because of this, rest becomes difficult. Not because the body is incapable of resting, but because the mind does not allow it. There is always something that feels like it needs to be handled first. A thought that feels urgent, a feeling that feels pressing, a memory that feels unresolved. And so the system stays active. The Stoics saw this pattern clearly. They understood that the mind often mistakes importance for urgency. Just because something feels intense does not mean it must be addressed immediately. But the mind, when untrained, reacts differently. It treats every signal as if it were critical. Every discomfort becomes something to fix right away. Every thought becomes something to analyze quickly. Every feeling becomes something to resolve immediately. And over time, this creates a constant state of acceleration. The nervous system adapts to this pace. It begins to expect speed. It begins to operate as if slowing down is unsafe. This is why stillness can feel uncomfortable, because the system is used to movement, used to urgency, used to responding quickly. So when the body tries to rest, the mind keeps pushing forward. It says, "Deal with this now." It says, "Think about this before you forget." It says, "Do not relax yet." But here is the truth. Not every thought needs speed. Not every feeling needs immediate resolution. Not everything that arises is an emergency. This is where the Stoic shift begins. Instead of reacting instantly, you begin to pause. You create a small space between the thought and the response. You allow things to exist without rushing to act on them. This pause changes everything. Because urgency loses its power when it is not immediately obeyed. A thought that feels urgent becomes less intense when you do not chase it. A feeling that feels pressing softens when you allow it to be there without rushing to fix it. The system begins to slow down, not through force, but through non-participation in the rush. This is not about ignoring what matters. It is about recognizing that most things do not need to be handled right now. There is a difference between importance and urgency. Something can be important and still not require immediate action. The Stoics lived with this understanding. They responded with care, not with speed. They knew that reacting too quickly often leads to more confusion, more tension, more error. And that calm response comes from allowing time, not from rushing against it. When you begin to apply this, even in small ways, the body starts to change. The breath slows. The muscles soften. The mind becomes less sharp, less frantic. There is more space between thoughts, more room for stillness, because the system is no longer being pushed into constant motion. So tonight, when a thought appears and feels urgent, do not follow it immediately. Let it be there. Notice it. But do not rush. If a feeling rises and asks for attention, acknowledge it. But do not try to solve it right away. Give it space. Let it exist without pressure. This may feel unnatural at first, because the habit of urgency is strong. But each time you choose not to rush, you are teaching the system something new. That not everything requires immediate action, that it is safe to slow down. That stillness is not a threat. And as this becomes clearer, the pace of the mind begins to change. It becomes less reactive, less pressured, more steady. The constant push begins to fade, and in its place there is a quieter rhythm. A rhythm that allows the body to rest, because it is no longer being driven by urgency. This is where real calm begins to settle, not from forcing the mind to be quiet, but from removing the pressure that kept it moving so fast. And as that pressure lifts, even slightly, the system begins to soften. The breath becomes deeper. The body becomes heavier in a good way. The mind becomes less demanding, and rest starts to feel possible again, not because everything has been handled, but because nothing is being treated like an emergency anymore. And in that space, the body finally receives the message it has been waiting for. It is safe to slow down, and safe to rest. And as that inner urgency begins to slow, another quiet pattern reveals itself. Not the rush toward the future this time, but the pull backward into moments that have already passed. There are nights when the body is here, but the mind is somewhere else entirely. Back in a conversation that ended hours ago. back in a mistake that cannot be undone, back in a moment that keeps replaying, as if returning to it might somehow change it. The scene feels vivid, the words feel fresh, the emotions return, as if the moment is happening again. And without noticing, you are no longer lying in your bed. You are mentally standing inside a room that no longer exists. This is how the mind lives in the past, not as memory, but as re-experience. It revisits old conversations, searching for better responses. It replays situations, looking for what should have been said. It returns to moments of embarrassment, regret or hurt, trying to rewrite something that cannot be rewritten. It feels like reflection, but it is something else. It is attachment, a quiet refusal to let certain moments be finished. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the past holds power only when the mind keeps returning to it without closure, not because the past is still active, but because the mind keeps feeding it attention. Every time you replay a moment, you give it new life. Every time you revisit a conversation, you reopen something that had already ended, and the body responds. The same tension returns, the same emotions rise again, the same weight settles in the chest. Not because the moment is happening again, but because the mind is treating it as if it is. This is why the past can feel so heavy at night, because there are fewer distractions, fewer interruptions, more space for these old rooms to open again. And once you step inside, it can be hard to leave. The mind may say, "I need to figure this out." It may say, "I should have done something different." It may say, "This still matters." But here is the truth that begins to bring release. You cannot resolve the past by re-entering it. You can only understand it and then step out of it. This is where Stoic detachment becomes powerful. Detachment does not mean forgetting. It does not mean pretending something did not happen. It means seeing the past for what it is. Finished. The event has already played out. The words have already been spoken. The outcome has already unfolded. What remains is not the event itself, only your relationship to it. And that relationship is what can change. Instead of stepping back into the moment, you begin to observe it from where you are now. You see it as something that happened, not something that is still happening. You recognize that the version of you in that moment was doing what it could with what it knew at the time. You allow the situation to exist without trying to correct it. This is not easy, because the mind wants closure. It wants a better ending. It wants to feel like things were handled perfectly. But life does not always give perfect endings, and trying to create them in your mind only keeps you stuck. The Stoic path invites you to accept this, not as defeat, but as freedom. Because once you stop trying to rewrite the past, you stop giving it energy. And when it no longer receives energy, it begins to fade. The door begins to close, not forcefully, but naturally. Each time you notice yourself stepping back into an old moment, you gently step out, not by pushing it away, but by reminding yourself this has already happened. You bring your attention back to where you are, back to the body, back to the breath, back to the present moment, where nothing from the past is actually occurring. This return is simple, but powerful, because it breaks the cycle. The past is no longer being relived. It is being remembered and released. And as this practice continues, something begins to change. The intensity of those old moments softens. The need to revisit them becomes less strong. The body stops reacting as if those situations are still active. There is more space, more distance, more peace. This does not mean the past disappears completely. It means it no longer holds you in the same way. It becomes something you carry lightly instead of something you live inside. So tonight, if the mind tries to return to an old room, notice it. Do not follow it all the way in. Stand at the doorway, see it for what it is, a memory, not a current reality, and gently turn back to the present, back to the body resting here, back to the quiet space where nothing needs to be replayed, because you do not need to go back to find peace. Peace is not waiting in those old rooms. It is here, in this moment, where the past is allowed to remain where it belongs, behind you, closed, and no longer needing to be entered again. And as those old rooms begin to close, another quiet truth comes forward. Not about the past, not about the future, but about what fills the space in between. Because when the mind is no longer rushing ahead and no longer replaying what has already happened, something unusual appears. Silence. And for many people, silence does not feel peaceful at first. It feels unfamiliar. There is a kind of discomfort that rises when the noise fades, a subtle unease, a feeling that something is missing, not because something is wrong, but because the mind is used to being full of thoughts, full of analysis, full of constant movement. This is where another hidden pattern reveals itself, the addiction to mental noise. It is not always obvious. But over time, the mind can become so used to thinking, reacting, and processing that it begins to depend on it. Noise becomes normal. Activity becomes identity. The constant flow of thoughts starts to feel like who you are. So when that noise begins to quiet down, even slightly, the mind does not immediately relax. It searches. It tries to bring something back. A thought, a memory, a problem to solve, anything to fill the space again. Because without the noise, there is a strange feeling. Who am I without all these thoughts? This is where the discomfort comes from. Not from silence itself, but from unfamiliarity. The Stoics understood that the mind often clings to what it knows, even if what it knows is exhausting. They saw that many people do not fear stress as much as they fear stillness, because stillness removes distraction. It brings you face to face with yourself, and if you are used to defining yourself through constant thinking, that space can feel empty at first. So the mind fills it again, not because it needs to, but because it has learned to. This is why some people find it hard to sit quietly without reaching for something, a phone, a conversation, a new thought, a new worry, anything that keeps the inner noise going, because noise feels like engagement, and silence feels like absence. But this is where the deeper shift begins. Silence is not absence. It is presence without interference. It is the space where the mind is not being pulled in different directions, the place where awareness is not crowded by constant activity. At first, this space can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, but that discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is changing. The system is moving away from constant stimulation and toward something quieter, something more stable. The Stoic practice invites you to stay with this space, not to fill it immediately, not to escape it, but to let it be. If there is silence, allow it. If there is stillness, remain with it. There is no need to rush back into noise, because the noise was never what gave you clarity. It only kept you occupied. Real clarity comes when the mind is no longer crowded, when thoughts are not competing for attention, when awareness has room to expand. This is where healing begins, not in more thinking, but in less interference. When the mind is quiet, the body begins to settle. The breath becomes slower. The muscles soften. The nervous system shifts out of constant activity. There is less effort, less pressure, less need to do anything at all. This can feel strange at first, because the habit of noise is strong. The mind may try to bring thoughts back. It may say, Think about this. It may say, "You are wasting time." It may say, "You should be doing something." But notice that voice. It is the habit speaking, not a necessity. You do not need to follow it. You can let the thought pass and remain in the quiet. And each time you do this, something changes. The silence becomes less uncomfortable. The stillness becomes more familiar. The need for constant noise begins to fade. You start to experience a different kind of presence, one that does not depend on thinking, one that does not require constant movement, one that feels steady, even when nothing is happening. This is where deep rest begins to unfold, not because the mind has been forced to stop, but because it no longer feels the need to keep going. So tonight, if there is silence, let it stay. Do not rush to fill it. Do not search for something to think about. Just remain, even if it feels unfamiliar, even if it feels empty for a moment, because within that space, something important is happening. The mind is learning that it does not need noise to exist. The body is learning that stillness is safe. And slowly, gently, the whole system begins to settle into a deeper kind of calm. Not the calm of distraction, but the calm of nothing needing to be added. And in that calm, rest begins to feel natural again, not something you chase, but something that arrives when the noise is no longer required to feel like yourself. And as that silence becomes more familiar, another quiet resistance begins to show itself. Not loud, not obvious, but strong enough to keep the body from fully letting go. There are moments when the body is clearly tired, the eyes feel heavy, the muscles are ready to soften, the breath wants to slow, everything is pointing toward rest, and yet something inside is still holding on. The body says, "Let go." But the mind says, "Not yet." This is where the paradox begins, because the tiredness is real, but so is the resistance. It is not the body that is refusing rest. It is something else, something more subtle, the part of you that keeps calculating, holding, managing, even when there is nothing left to manage. This is where the ego quietly steps in, not as arrogance, but as control. The ego is the part that wants to stay in charge, the part that feels safer when it is thinking, planning, organizing, holding everything together. It does not trust stillness easily, because stillness feels like losing control. So even when the body is ready to rest, the ego keeps grasping. It looks for something to think about. It revisits problems that feel unresolved. It creates small tasks in the mind just to stay active, not because it needs to, but because it is used to being engaged. There is a fear hidden inside this, a quiet fear that if you fully let go, something will be missed, something will fall apart, something important will slip through your awareness. So the mind stays alert, even in stillness, even in silence, even when there is nothing actually happening. This is why some people lie down exhausted but cannot descend into sleep, because letting go feels like giving up control, and control has become a form of safety. The Stoics understood this deeply. They saw that much of human tension comes not from external pressure, but from internal grasping. The constant need to hold on to thoughts, to manage outcomes, to stay involved in everything. But they also taught something simple. What you are holding on to is not always helping you. Sometimes it is what is keeping you from rest. The mind believes it is being useful, but in reality it is just staying busy, and that busyness creates friction. The more the mind holds, the less the body can release. The more the mind grasps, the harder it becomes to soften. Because the system is divided, One part wants to rest, another part refuses. This division is what creates the feeling of being stuck, not fully awake, not fully asleep, just held in between. The Stoic shift begins when you start to see this clearly, when you recognize that not every thought needs to be followed, that not every problem needs to be solved right now, that not everything needs to be held in your awareness. This recognition creates a small opening, a moment where you can choose not to grasp, not to hold, not to engage. At first, this feels unfamiliar, because the habit of control is strong. The mind may try to pull you back. It may say, think about this one more time. It may say, do not forget this. It may say, stay alert. But you do not have to follow it. You can notice the urge and let it pass. You can feel the pull to think and not act on it. You can allow the mind to be active without joining it. This is where something begins to change. The grip starts to loosen, not all at once, but enough. Enough for the breath to deepen slightly. Enough for the shoulders to drop a little more. Enough for the body to feel that it is no longer being held in constant tension. This is not forcing the mind to stop. It is simply stepping out of its movement. And when you step out, the system begins to settle. The ego does not disappear, but it becomes quieter, less demanding, less controlling, because it is no longer being fed with constant attention. There is a soft transition that happens here, from holding to allowing, from controlling to trusting, from grasping to releasing. And in that transition, the body finally begins to receive what it has been asking for. Rest, not because everything is resolved, not because every thought is gone, but because the need to hold everything has been reduced. So tonight, there is nothing you need to keep in your mind, nothing you need to carry into the next moment. If a thought appears, let it pass. If the mind reaches for something, let it reach. But do not follow. You are not required to stay involved. You are allowed to step back. And as you do, even gently, the grip begins to loosen. The tension begins to fade. The system begins to soften. Because it is no longer being held together by constant effort. It is being allowed to settle on its own. And in that settling, something quiet begins to return. A sense of ease, a sense of space, a sense that nothing needs to be managed right now. And within that space, the body finally lets go, not by force, but by permission. And that is where real rest begins. Not when the body is tired, but when the mind finally stops holding on. And as that grip of control begins to loosen, another hidden weight comes into view. Not about thoughts, not about the past, but about identity. The quiet pressure to be more than you are right now. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from doing too much, but from trying to be too much. It lives quietly in the background. The need to matter, the need to stand out, the need to prove something, even when no one is asking. It is not always spoken, but it is deeply felt. A subtle voice that says, you must become something important. A pressure that says, you cannot just be ordinary. A quiet discomfort with simply existing without achieving, impressing or being recognized. This is the fear of becoming ordinary. And it carries more weight than most people realize because it never fully turns off. Even when the day ends, it continues. The mind starts measuring. Am I doing enough? Am I becoming enough? Am I falling behind? It compares, it evaluates, it pushes. And over time, this creates a constant tension, not from what you are doing, but from what you believe you must become. The Stoics saw through this illusion. They understood that much of human suffering comes from attaching self-worth to external validation, to status, recognition, achievement, or the approval of others. When your sense of value depends on these things, rest becomes difficult, because there is always more to prove, always another level to reach, always another version of yourself that feels just out of reach. So the mind keeps working, even in silence, even in stillness. It keeps trying to move forward. But there is a quiet truth underneath all of this. The pressure to be exceptional often comes at the cost of peace, because it turns life into a constant performance. Every action becomes a step toward proving something. Every moment becomes something to optimize. Even rest begins to feel like a waste of time. And when rest feels like a waste, the body never fully allows it. There is always a pull to do more, to think more, to become more. This is why some people feel restless even when they have done enough. Because enough never feels like enough when your value is tied to being extraordinary. The Stoic path offers a different perspective. It shifts the focus away from how you are seen and back to how you live. It reminds you that your worth is not measured by how impressive your life looks, but by how aligned your actions are with your values. And this changes everything. Because when you are no longer trying to impress, there is less pressure. When you are no longer trying to prove, there is more space. When you are no longer chasing an ideal version of yourself, you begin to return to who you already are. This does not mean you stop growing. It means you stop forcing growth from a place of insecurity. You stop trying to become exceptional just to feel worthy, and instead you begin to act with clarity, without the constant need for recognition. This is where a different kind of strength appears, a quieter one that does not need to be seen to exist, one that does not depend on comparison, one that allows you to move through life without carrying the weight of constant self-evaluation. And when that weight is removed, something begins to soften. The mind becomes less driven, the body becomes less tense. The need to constantly move forward begins to fade. There is more space to simply be. This is where rest becomes possible again, because rest is not just the absence of activity, it is the absence of pressure. So tonight, there is nothing you need to prove, nothing you need to become, nothing you need to measure. You are not required to be extraordinary in this moment. You are not required to impress anyone. You are not required to move forward. You are allowed to be still. You are allowed to be enough. Not as an idea, but as a direct experience. And as you allow that, even slightly, the system begins to change. The constant push begins to quiet. The need to compare begins to loosen. The identity built around achievement begins to soften. And in its place, there is something simpler, something steadier, a sense of presence without performance, a sense of worth without effort. And within that space, the body finally begins to rest. Not because everything has been accomplished, but because nothing needs to be proven anymore. And that is where a deeper kind of peace begins to settle, quietly, naturally, without needing to become anything else. And as that pressure to be exceptional begins to soften, another habit quietly reveals itself. Not just the need to prove, but the constant need to measure. There is a subtle way the mind turns life into a scoreboard, not always with numbers, but with quiet comparisons. Am I doing better than before? Am I behind others? Am I improving fast enough? Am I feeling what I should be feeling right now? This measuring does not always feel harsh. Sometimes it feels responsible, like you are keeping track, like you are staying aware. But over time it creates something else, a constant state of evaluation. Every moment is checked, every emotion is questioned, every action is weighed against some invisible standard. And because of this, nothing is simply lived, everything is assessed. This is the habit that quietly breaks rest, because rest requires a certain kind of letting go. A pause in evaluation, a space where nothing is being judged, tracked, or compared. But when the mind is measuring constantly, that space never fully appears. Even in stillness, the evaluation continues. The mind asks, "Am I relaxed enough?" It asks, "Is this working?" It asks, "Why don't I feel better yet?" And with each question, tension returns. Because measuring creates pressure. It turns the present moment into something that must meet a standard. And when it does not, the mind keeps adjusting, trying to improve the moment, trying to fix the experience, trying to move toward something better. But this movement prevents settling. The body cannot fully relax when it is being constantly monitored. The mind cannot become quiet when it is being constantly checked. This is where fragmentation begins. One part of you is experiencing the moment. Another part of you is analyzing that experience. Another part is comparing it to what it should be. And these parts do not move together. They pull in different directions. This creates a sense of inner division, a feeling that you are never fully present, because part of you is always outside the moment, evaluating it. The Stoics understood that this kind of self-measurement can become a form of distraction, not because reflection is bad, but because constant reflection removes you from direct experience. There is a time to reflect, and there is a time to simply be. When these two are mixed together constantly, neither works well. You are not fully present, and you are not fully reflecting. You are stuck in between. This is why the mind feels busy even when nothing is happening, because it is not just experiencing, it is judging the experience at the same time. The Stoic shift is simple but powerful. You begin to separate observation from evaluation. You notice what is happening, without immediately turning it into something that needs to be improved. If the body feels tense, you notice it, but you do not ask if it should be different. If the mind feels active, you see it, but you do not measure whether it is too active. This removes pressure, because the moment is no longer being compared to an ideal. It is allowed to exist as it is, and in that allowance, something begins to settle. The mind becomes less sharp, less critical, less driven to adjust everything. There is more space, more ease, more continuity between what you feel and how you respond to it. The fragmentation begins to close. You are no longer split between living and judging. You are simply here. This is where restoration begins. Not through improvement, but through non-interference. So tonight, there is nothing you need to track, nothing you need to measure, nothing you need to evaluate. You do not need to check if this moment is good enough. You do not need to compare it to anything else. You do not need to improve how you are feeling. Just let it be. Let the experience unfold without turning it into a report, without turning it into progress, without turning it into something that must be optimized. At first, this may feel unfamiliar, because the habit of measuring is strong. The mind may try to return to it. It may ask, "Is this working?" It may ask, "Am I doing this right?" But you can let those questions pass. You do not need to answer them, because this moment is not something to get right. It is something to be in. And as you stay with it, even gently, something begins to change. The pressure fades. The mind softens. The body begins to feel less watched, less controlled. There is more wholeness, more continuity, more ease, and in that ease, rest becomes possible again. Not because you reached a certain state, but because you stopped measuring your way into it. And that is where a deeper kind of calm begins to unfold, quietly, naturally, without needing to be evaluated at all. And as that constant measuring begins to fade, another quiet habit starts to loosen its grip. Not just the need to evaluate each moment, but the need to judge the entire day before allowing it to end. There is a subtle ritual many people carry into the night. Before the body rests, the mind reviews. It looks back over everything that happened, what was done, what was missed, what could have been better, what should have gone differently, and without realizing it, the day is placed on a scale. Was it good enough? Was it productive enough? Was it a success or a failure? This search for a verdict feels natural, like closing a chapter, like making sense of the day. But often, it creates something else, pressure, because the mind rarely gives a gentle answer. It focuses on what went wrong. It highlights what was incomplete. It replays small mistakes and turns them into something larger. And instead of closing the day, it keeps it open. Unfinished. Because once the mind labels the day as not enough, it begins to revisit it, trying to fix it, trying to improve it, trying to squeeze a different meaning out of something that has already passed. And in doing so, rest is delayed. The Stoics understood that this need for judgment can become a quiet source of suffering, not because reflection is wrong, but because harsh evaluation keeps the mind active. It turns the day into something that must be resolved before peace is allowed. But here is the truth. The day does not need a verdict to end. It has already ended. No amount of reviewing will change it. No amount of labeling will complete it. It is already complete. As it is. When the mind demands a verdict, it is trying to create closure through judgment. But real closure does not come from judgment. It comes from acceptance, from allowing the day to exist without forcing it into categories, not calling it good, not calling it bad, just seeing it as a part of life that has unfolded and is now finished. This is where the Stoic practice becomes freeing. Instead of asking, "Was today successful?" you begin to ask, "Did I show up as best as I could with what I had?" And even this question does not need a perfect answer, because the goal is not to score the day, it is to release it, to let it go without carrying it forward. When you stop demanding a verdict, something begins to soften. The mind no longer needs to review every detail. It no longer needs to replay every moment. It no longer needs to search for a final judgment. The pressure fades, and in that space, the day begins to close naturally, not through force, but through letting go. This does not mean you ignore what happened. It means you stop turning it into something that must be perfected after it is already over. There will always be things left undone, things that could have gone differently, moments that were not handled perfectly. This is not failure. This is life. And life does not need to be labeled every night for it to move forward. So tonight, let the day end without a conclusion. Let it remain as it was, a collection of moments, some clear, some messy, some complete, some unfinished. You do not need to organize them. You do not need to judge them. You do not need to place them into a final category. Just allow them to fade, like a conversation that has ended, like a scene that has passed. There is nothing more to do with it now, and as you allow this, something begins to shift. The mind stops holding on to the day. The body begins to feel lighter. The need to revisit what has already happened begins to weaken. There is less weight, less tension, less need to carry anything forward. This is where rest begins to deepen, not because everything was perfect, but because nothing is being held against yourself anymore. The day is no longer something to fix. It is something to release. And in that release, there is a quiet kind of peace, the kind that does not depend on performance, the kind that does not require approval. the kind that allows you to rest without needing to justify the day you just lived. So let it end, without judgment, without conclusion, without a verdict. And as you do, the mind finally begins to settle, because it is no longer searching for answers that are no longer needed. It is simply letting go. And in that letting go, sleep becomes closer, not forced, not earned, but naturally allowed. And as the day is finally allowed to end without judgment, another quiet tension begins to reveal its source, not from what was done, not from what was left undone, but from what was never said, even to yourself. There is a kind of tightness the body carries that does not come from effort. It comes from silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind where something true is being held back. A boundary that was never spoken, a feeling that was never admitted, a truth that was seen, but quietly pushed aside. These moments do not always seem important at the time. You move on. You keep things smooth. You avoid conflict. You tell yourself it is easier this way, and on the surface it works. But underneath, the body remembers. It holds that moment. In the jaw that stays slightly tight, in the chest that does not fully open, in the breath that never quite settles into ease. This is not random. This is the body responding to what the mind avoids. The Stoics understood that inner conflict does not come from truth itself, but from resisting it. When something true is seen and not acknowledged, a quiet division is created inside you. One part of you knows, another part refuses to face it, and in that split, tension grows. It may not be loud, but it is constant. Because the body does not relax when something important is being suppressed. It stays alert, as if it is waiting for something to be resolved. This is why some tension feels difficult to explain. There is no clear external cause, no obvious reason. And yet, the body feels tight. The mind feels slightly uneasy. There is a sense that something is not fully settled. Often this is not about what is happening now. It is about what was not allowed to be true. Maybe it was a moment when you wanted to say no, but said yes. Maybe it was a situation where something felt wrong, but you ignored it. Maybe it was grief that needed to be felt, but was pushed aside because it felt too heavy. These are not small things, even if they seem small in the moment, because each time truth is avoided, the body absorbs it. It carries the weight of what was not expressed. And over time, that weight becomes tension, not just physical, but emotional, energetic, a quiet holding. The Stoic path does not ask you to express everything outwardly. It asks for something deeper. Inner honesty, the courage to see clearly what is true for you without turning away. This does not require action in every moment. It requires acknowledgement. Because when something is acknowledged internally, the division begins to close. The part of you that knows and the part of you that resists begin to come back together. And in that unity, tension starts to soften. You no longer need to hold the truth down. You no longer need to pretend it is not there. You simply allow it to exist. This may feel uncomfortable at first, because honesty brings clarity, and clarity sometimes brings emotion. But emotion is not the problem. Suppression is. When something is allowed to be felt, even quietly, the body begins to release. The breath changes. The muscles begin to loosen. The nervous system shifts, because it no longer has to guard against what is being hidden. So tonight, there is nothing you need to force yourself to say, nothing you need to fix immediately. But there may be something to notice, something that feels slightly off, something that has been sitting quietly in the background. Do not push it away. Do not rush past it. Just let yourself see it, without judgment, without pressure, without the need to act right now, because seeing clearly is already a form of release. And as you allow that clarity, even gently, the body begins to respond. The tension softens, the breath deepens, the sense of holding begins to fade. Not because everything has been resolved, but because nothing is being hidden anymore. And when nothing is hidden, the system no longer needs to stay tight. It begins to open, slowly, naturally, in its own time. And in that opening, something quiet returns. A sense of ease, a sense of alignment, a sense that you are no longer carrying what was never meant to be held in silence. And within that space, rest becomes possible again, not forced, not controlled, but allowed through the simple courage of being honest with yourself. And as that inner honesty begins to open space, another pattern quietly comes into view. Not about what was left unsaid in real life, but about what continues to be said long after the moment has passed. There are conversations that do not end when the other person leaves. They continue in the mind. You replay what was said. You imagine what you should have said. You build new versions of the same interaction over and over again. Sometimes you defend yourself. Sometimes you explain. Sometimes you argue. Sometimes you win the conversation perfectly, but only in your head. And while all of this is happening, the body remains still, but the mind is not at rest. This is the burden of imaginary conversations. It feels like processing. It feels like preparing. But often it is neither. It is repetition without resolution, because the person is not there. The moment is over, and yet the mind keeps returning, trying to fix something that cannot be fixed through thought alone. This habit is more common than it seems. It can come from wanting to be understood, from feeling unheard, from holding on to frustration or regret, from wishing a moment had gone differently, and instead of allowing that moment to end, the mind keeps it alive. It reopens the conversation. It adds new lines. It tries to complete something that was never completed. But here is the quiet truth. Imaginary conversations do not bring closure. They create attachment. Because every time you replay the interaction, you strengthen the connection to it. You give it more energy. You make it feel more present than it actually is. And the body responds. The same tension returns. The same emotions rise again. The same sense of urgency appears. Not because anything new is happening, but because the mind is reliving it. The Stoics understood that this kind of mental activity is a form of unnecessary suffering, not because thinking is wrong, but because thinking without action, without presence, without reality, becomes a drain, a quiet theft of energy. Every moment spent arguing with someone who is not there is a moment taken away from the present, a moment where the body could be resting, a moment where the mind could be quiet, but instead it is occupied, pulled into a loop that has no real end point. This is why these conversations feel exhausting, because they do not move forward. They circle, and the more they circle, the more energy they take. The Stoic shift begins with recognition. Seeing clearly that this is not a real conversation, it is a mental loop, and like any loop, it continues only as long as it is being followed. When you notice yourself inside one of these imagined exchanges, you do not need to fight it. You do not need to force it to stop. You simply see it for what it is, a thought pattern, not reality. This creates a small distance, a moment where you are no longer fully inside the conversation. You are observing it, and from that place, something becomes possible. You can step out, not by finishing the conversation, but by letting it remain unfinished. This may feel uncomfortable at first, because the mind wants closure, It wants the final word. It wants to feel understood, even if only in imagination. But true closure does not come from winning a conversation in your head. It comes from releasing the need to continue it. This is where the energy returns. When you stop feeding the loop, it begins to lose strength. The imagined voices become quieter. The emotional charge begins to soften. The body starts to relax, because it is no longer reacting to something that is not actually happening. So tonight, if a conversation begins to replay, notice it. Do not jump into it fully. Do not try to correct every line. Do not try to perfect the outcome. Just see it. See how the mind builds it. See how it pulls you in. And gently step back. Let the conversation exist without participating in it. Let it fade without completing it, because it does not need to be completed. It is already over. And as you step out of it, something begins to shift. The mind becomes less occupied. The body becomes less tense. The energy that was being used to maintain that loop begins to return. There is more space, more quiet, more presence. This is where rest begins to deepen, not because every thought has been removed, but because you are no longer giving your energy to thoughts that do not lead anywhere. You are no longer arguing with absence. You are no longer trying to resolve what can only be released. And in that release, the mind begins to settle. The body begins to soften. The whole system begins to move towards stillness, because nothing is being held open anymore. Nothing is being replayed. Nothing is being forced to continue. There is only this moment, and in this moment, there is no conversation happening, only quiet, only space, only the gentle return of your energy back to where it belongs. And that is where real rest begins to take root. And as those imagined conversations begin to fade, another strange feeling can appear. Not noise this time, not tension from the past, but something quieter. Peace. And yet, instead of feeling relief, there is hesitation, a subtle discomfort, a feeling that something is not quite right. Because for a mind that has been working constantly, stillness does not immediately feel safe. It feels unfamiliar, almost suspicious. There is a kind of conditioning that happens when the mind is used to being busy all the time, always thinking, always solving, always anticipating. Over time, this becomes normal. The mind begins to associate activity with safety, movement with control, effort with stability. So when that activity slows down, something feels off. The mind begins to question it. Why is it so quiet? Am I forgetting something? Should I be doing something right now? This is the overworked mind trying to return to what it knows, not because peace is dangerous, but because peace is unfamiliar. There is a hidden belief underneath this, a belief that says, if I am not thinking, something might go wrong. So the mind stays active, even when it is tired, even when there is nothing left to solve, because slowing down feels like losing awareness, and losing awareness feels like losing control. This is why stillness can feel uncomfortable at first. The body may be ready to rest, but the mind does not trust it yet. It has been trained to stay alert, to scan for problems, to keep moving, and when that movement stops, it feels like something is missing. The Stoics understood this deeply. They saw that peace is not something the mind immediately accepts. It is something the mind must learn to trust, because peace removes the need for constant effort. And effort has become a form of identity. When you are used to being the one who thinks, who manages, who solves, who carries, letting go of that can feel like stepping into something uncertain. Who are you when you are not doing all of that? What happens when you stop? These questions do not always appear clearly, but they are felt, and the response is often the same. The mind goes back to work. It brings in new thoughts. It creates small problems. It looks for something to engage with, anything to avoid staying in the quiet. But this is where the shift begins, not by forcing the mind to accept peace, but by gently staying with it, even when it feels unfamiliar, even when it feels slightly uncomfortable. You allow the stillness to be there. You do not rush to fill it. You do not search for something to do. You simply remain. And slowly, something begins to change. The mind starts to realize that nothing is going wrong, that silence is not a threat, that stillness does not mean something is being missed. This realization is not instant. It builds through experience. Each moment you stay in the quiet without reacting, the system learns something new, that it is safe to not be active, that it is safe to not be solving, that it is safe to simply exist without effort. And as this learning deepens, the discomfort begins to fade. The suspicion softens. The need to return to constant thinking becomes weaker. The body begins to feel more at ease. The breath settles. The muscles release. The whole system starts to recognize that this quiet space is not empty. It is restorative. This is where peace becomes natural. Not because it was forced, but because it was allowed long enough to become familiar. So tonight, if stillness feels strange, let it be strange. You do not need to rush out of it. You do not need to replace it with noise. You do not need to make it comfortable immediately. Just stay. Let the quiet exist. Let the mind slow down at its own pace. Let the body feel what it feels without trying to change it. Because the goal is not to create peace. It is to stop running from it. And as you stop running, even gently, something begins to settle. The mind becomes less suspicious. The body becomes more open. The system begins to trust what it once resisted. And within that trust, rest becomes deeper. Not because everything has been solved, but because nothing is being avoided anymore. There is no need to return to noise. No need to fill the space. No need to keep working. There is only this quiet moment, and slowly, gently, it begins to feel safe. Safe enough to stay. Safe enough to soften. Safe enough to rest. And as that stillness begins to feel safer, another quiet source of tension starts to loosen. Not from what you are doing, not from what you are thinking, but from how you are being seen. There is a hidden desire many people carry without naming it. The need to be understood, not just by a few, but by everyone. To be seen clearly, to be interpreted correctly, to have your intentions recognized, to have your words land exactly as you meant them. And when this does not happen, something inside tightens. A quiet frustration, a subtle feeling of being misread, a lingering thought that says, "They don't get me." During the day, this may pass quickly, but at night, it returns. You replay what you said. You imagine how you should have explained it better. You think about how someone misunderstood you, and how you wish they could see it differently. And without noticing, the mind becomes occupied again, not with the future, not with the past alone, but with the need to correct how you exist in someone else's mind. This is where the suffering begins, because that place is not yours to control. The Stoics were very clear about this. You control your actions. You do not control how others interpret them. You can speak clearly. You cannot force understanding. You can act with intention. You cannot guarantee perception. And when you try to control what cannot be controlled, tension grows. The mind keeps reaching outward, trying to adjust something that lives in another person's perspective, trying to shape an image that you cannot fully access. and this effort never ends. Because there will always be someone who misunderstands, someone who sees through their own lens, someone who cannot meet you where you are. This is not a failure. It is part of life. But when the mind resists this truth, it creates pressure, the need to explain more, the need to clarify again, the need to fix how you are being seen. And this need does not rest easily. It follows you into stillness. It keeps the mind active, because it is searching for a version of reality where everyone understands you perfectly. And that version does not exist. This is where the Stoic release becomes powerful, not by giving up on communication, but by letting go of the need for universal understanding. You begin to see that being understood by everyone is not necessary for peace, that your worth is not determined by how accurately others perceive you. That clarity in your own actions matters more than clarity in their interpretation. This shifts your energy from outward control back to inward steadiness. You stop trying to manage how you exist in other people's minds, and you begin to rest in how you exist within yourself. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop over-carrying. You express yourself clearly, and then you let it be. You allow others to interpret as they will, not because it does not matter, but because it is no longer your burden. And when this burden is released, something softens. The need to replay conversations fades. The urge to correct every misunderstanding weakens. The mind becomes less occupied with what others think. There is more space, more quiet, more freedom, because you are no longer chasing something that cannot be fully achieved. This is deeply freeing, because it returns your attention to what is actually within your reach. Your actions, your intentions, your presence, and within that space, rest becomes possible again. Not because everything has been explained perfectly, but because nothing needs to be explained anymore. So tonight, there is nothing you need to clarify, nothing you need to correct, nothing you need to fix in someone else's perception. If a thought arises about being misunderstood, notice it, but do not follow it. Let it pass. Because your peace does not depend on their understanding, it depends on your ability to release the need for it. And as you do, even gently, something begins to settle. The mind becomes less restless. The body becomes less tense. The need to reach outward begins to fade. And in its place, there is a quiet stability, a sense of being at ease with yourself, without needing validation, without needing approval, without needing to be seen perfectly. And in that space, rest deepens, not because the world understands you, but because you are no longer trying to make it do so. And that is where a deeper kind of peace begins to unfold, quietly, naturally, without needing to be explained at all. And as that need to be understood begins to fall away, another hidden force becomes easier to see. Not the search for clarity this time, but the tension underneath the constant thinking itself. There is a kind of overthinking that feels like effort, but beneath it, there is something else. A quiet resistance, a subtle frustration, a feeling that something should have been different. Overthinking often looks like analysis, like trying to understand, like trying to figure things out. But if you look closely, there is often an emotional charge behind it. Something that does not accept what has already happened. Something that keeps returning to the same point, not to learn, but to change it. This is where the quiet rage lives, not loud, not explosive, but steady. It shows up as repeated thoughts, going over the same situation again and again, replaying what was said, reimagining what should have been done, trying to rewrite the outcome in the mind. It feels like thinking, but it is actually resistance. resistance to reality, because reality did not follow the script the mind expected. And the mind struggles with that. It says, "This should not have happened." It says, "It should have gone differently." It says, "I should have known better." And because it cannot change what has already occurred, it keeps thinking about it, trying to gain control after the fact, trying to reshape something that is already complete. The Stoics understood this pattern deeply. They saw that suffering often comes not from the event itself, but from the refusal to accept it as it is. When the mind holds on to how things should have been, it creates tension, because it is arguing with something that cannot respond. Reality has already moved on, but the mind stays behind, and this creates a loop. The same thoughts return, the same emotions rise, the same tension builds, not because the situation is still active, but because the mind is still resisting it. This is why overthinking feels so draining, because it is not just thinking, it is thinking with resistance, thinking with frustration, thinking with a quiet form of anger that has nowhere to go. And when that energy has nowhere to go, it stays in the system. It circulates, it repeats, it keeps the mind active and the body tense. The Stoic shift begins with recognition, seeing clearly that this repetition is not solving anything. It is not bringing clarity. It is not creating a better outcome. It is simply keeping the mind attached to what has already passed. And once this is seen, something becomes possible. You can stop feeding it, not by forcing the thoughts away, but by removing the resistance behind them. Instead of saying, "This should not have happened," you begin to say, "This is what happened." This is not resignation. This is alignment, because the moment you stop arguing with reality, the tension begins to loosen. The need to replay the situation fades. The emotional charge begins to soften. The thoughts lose their intensity, not all at once, but gradually, because the energy that was fueling them, resistance, is no longer being added. This is where something changes inside. The mind becomes less reactive, less driven to revisit the same moment, more willing to let it be. And as this happens, the body begins to respond. The tightness in the chest eases, the jaw softens, the breath becomes deeper, because the system is no longer holding on to a fight that cannot be won. So tonight, if the mind returns to something again and again, notice it. Not just the thought, but the feeling underneath it, the frustration, the resistance, the quiet anger that says things should have been different, and instead of pushing it away, allow it to be seen. Without judgment, without feeding it further, just acknowledge it and gently shift from resistance to acceptance, from "this should not have happened" to "this has already happened." This shift is simple but powerful because it removes the fuel from the loop. And when the fuel is gone, the loop begins to fade. The thoughts become less frequent. The emotional charge becomes lighter. The system begins to settle. Because it is no longer holding on to what cannot be changed. There is nothing left to fight, nothing left to correct, only something to release. And in that release, the mind begins to quiet. Not because it was forced to stop, but because it no longer has a reason to continue. The quiet rage dissolves, the tension softens, the body relaxes, and within that space, rest becomes possible again. Not because everything went perfectly, but because nothing is being resisted anymore. And that is where a deeper kind of peace begins to take hold, quietly, naturally, without needing to think it into existence. And as that quiet resistance begins to dissolve, something even wider opens up. Not just a softer mind, not just a calmer body, but a different perspective altogether. Because sometimes what keeps the mind restless is not just what is happening, but how large it feels. Problems grow in size when they are held too close. Thoughts become heavy when they are treated as the center of everything. The mind narrows, and within that narrow space, everything feels urgent, personal, overwhelming. But there is another way to see, a way the Stoics return to often, a step back, not into distraction, but into scale. When the mind is pulled back, even slightly, something begins to shift. The things that felt overwhelming begin to shrink, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer the whole picture. There is a quiet reminder in this. You are part of something vast, not in a poetic way alone, but in a real, grounded sense. The same breath moving through you is part of a larger rhythm. The same life you are living is one small piece of a much wider unfolding. The same worries that feel so intense in this moment exist within a world that has seen countless moments rise and pass. The Stoics reflected often on the sky, on time, on the scale of existence, not to escape life, but to place it in context, because when everything is seen as immediate and personal, the mind tightens. But when perspective widens, the mind softens. Think of how many moments have already passed. Moments that once felt just as intense as this one. Moments that seemed like everything at the time, and now exist only as faint memories. Life moves, time moves. Nothing holds its exact shape for long. This is not something to fear. It is something that gently releases pressure. Because it reminds you, this moment is not permanent. This feeling is not permanent. This tension is not permanent. Everything you are experiencing is part of a flow that continues beyond it. And within that flow, there is space. More space than the mind often allows. When you step into this wider view, something changes inside. The need to control everything becomes less intense. The need to solve everything right now becomes less urgent, because you begin to see that not everything needs to be resolved in this single moment. You are not carrying the entire weight of existence. You are moving through it. This is where a quiet humility begins to appear, not as something small or limiting, but as something freeing. You do not need to hold everything together. You do not need to make everything perfect. You do not need to understand everything completely. You are allowed to exist within the larger movement of life, without needing to control its entire direction. This perspective softens the mind. It reduces the sense of pressure. It creates distance from the intensity of individual thoughts. Because those thoughts are no longer the center of everything. They are part of a much wider field. And within that field, they lose their weight. The Stoics called this a kind of inner expansion, a way of seeing that places your experience within the greater whole, not to diminish it, but to balance it. Because when everything feels equally important, the mind becomes overwhelmed. But when perspective returns, the mind begins to settle. It realizes that not every thought needs attention. Not every worry needs to be held tightly. Not every feeling defines the moment. There is more around it, more beyond it, more space to breathe. So tonight, allow yourself to step back, not away from your life, but into a wider view of it. Let your awareness expand. Let the moment exist within something larger, without needing to define it, without needing to control it. Just let it be part of the whole. And as you do, something begins to soften. The tightness in the mind eases. The urgency begins to fade. The body feels less contracted because it is no longer holding everything so closely. There is room again, room for the breath, room for stillness, room for rest. This is where the mind begins to return to its natural place, not as the center of everything, but as a part of something much greater. And in that place, there is less pressure, less fear, less need to hold on. Only a quiet sense of being, of existing within something vast, and not needing to control it. And as that understanding settles, even gently, the system begins to relax. The thoughts slow down. The body becomes heavier in a calm way. The mind becomes quieter, because it is no longer carrying the weight of being everything. It is simply being, and in that, rest becomes deeper. Not because everything has been resolved, but because everything has been placed back into its true size. And that is where a deeper kind of peace begins to unfold. Wide, quiet, and steady. And as that wider perspective begins to settle, something more intimate comes into view. Not the vastness outside you this time, but the quiet relationship within you. Because the mind does not live alone, the body is always listening. Every thought that repeats, every fear that lingers, every pattern that continues, the body begins to learn from it, not through words, but through sensation, through rhythm, through repetition. Over time, the body becomes a student of the mind. It learns what to expect. If the mind is often tense, the body learns tension. If the mind is often rushed, the body learns urgency. If the mind is often worried, the body learns to stay alert. This learning is subtle. You may not notice it happening, but it shapes how the body responds, even before you think. The shoulders tighten without reason. The breath becomes shallow without effort. The heart feels slightly on edge, even in quiet moments. Not because something is wrong, but because the body has been trained. It has adapted to the patterns it has been given. The Stoics understood that thoughts are not harmless when repeated. They create habits, not just in the mind, but in the body. And when these habits become consistent, they turn into expectation. The body begins to expect tension, to expect activity, to expect that something needs attention. So even when you try to rest, the body does not fully relax, because it has learned that rest is not the usual state. It has learned to stay ready. This is why simply telling yourself to calm down often does not work, because the body is not responding to instructions. It is responding to patterns, and patterns take time to change. This is where nightly meditation becomes powerful, not as a quick fix, but as a form of retraining. Each time you sit in stillness, each time you allow the breath to slow, each time you choose not to follow a thought, you are teaching the body something new. You are showing it a different pattern, a different rhythm, a different expectation. At first, the body may resist. It may stay tense. It may feel restless. It may not fully trust the stillness, because it is used to something else. But with repetition, something begins to shift. The body starts to recognize this new state. It begins to understand that not every moment requires tension, that not every thought needs a response, that it is safe to soften. This learning does not happen through force. It happens through consistency. Each moment of calm becomes a signal. Each breath taken slowly becomes a message. Each time you allow stillness without interruption, you are building a new expectation inside the body. An expectation of ease, an expectation of quiet, an expectation that not everything needs to be held tightly. This is how the nervous system changes, not through sudden control, but through repeated experience. Over time, the body begins to respond differently. The breath deepens more naturally. The muscles release more easily. The sense of alertness begins to fade, because the system is no longer expecting constant activity. It is learning a new way to be. This is where true restoration begins, not just in the mind, but in the whole system. Because when the body learns calm, rest becomes easier. It no longer needs to be convinced. It no longer needs to be forced. It begins to settle on its own. So tonight, as you remain here, there is nothing you need to change immediately, nothing you need to fix. Just notice. Notice the breath, notice the body, notice the space between thoughts, and allow it to be. Because each moment of allowing is a lesson, a quiet teaching that the body absorbs. You are not just calming the mind, you are retraining the system, gently, slowly, without pressure. And as this continues, something begins to feel different. The body becomes less guarded, the mind becomes less reactive. The whole system begins to move toward balance, not perfectly, but steadily. And in that steadiness, rest begins to deepen, not because you forced it, but because the body has finally learned that it is safe to be at ease. And that is where the deepest kind of calm begins to take root, quietly, naturally, from the inside out. And as the body begins to learn a new rhythm, something more hidden begins to surface, not from tension alone, not from thought patterns, but from a deeper feeling that sits quietly underneath it all. A feeling that says, you should not be resting. It does not always speak clearly, but it shows up in subtle ways. The moment the body begins to soften, something tightens again. The moment the mind begins to quiet, a thought appears that pulls you back into effort. The moment stillness starts to feel possible, something inside resists it. Not because rest is impossible, but because it feels undeserved. There is a kind of guilt that does not announce itself loudly. It lives in the background. A quiet sense that you have not done enough, that you could have been better, that something was missed, that something was wrong. And because of that, rest begins to feel like something you have not earned. The body may be tired, but the mind says, you should still be thinking. The system may be ready to let go, but something inside says, not yet. This is the guilty mind holding on to tension. It believes that letting go means avoiding responsibility, that softness means weakness, that rest means ignoring what should still be carried. But this belief is not truth. It is conditioning. Many people were taught in quiet ways that their value comes from effort, from doing, from pushing through, from correcting themselves constantly. And over time, this becomes internalized. You begin to measure yourself harshly. You begin to notice every flaw. You begin to hold yourself accountable, even when there is nothing left to fix. And this creates a subtle form of self-blame. Not always for something specific, but for a general sense of not being enough. This is where the resistance to rest begins. Because rest requires letting go. And letting go feels like allowing yourself to be at peace. But if the mind believes you have not earned that peace, it will not allow it easily. The Stoics approached this differently. They did not believe in punishing the self endlessly. They believed in clarity, not self-condemnation. They understood that mistakes are part of being human, that imperfection is not a failure, but a condition of life. And most importantly, they knew that holding on to guilt does not improve the present. It only burdens it. When the mind stays in self-blame, it creates tension. It keeps replaying what could have been done differently. It keeps reminding you of what was not enough. And in doing so, it blocks the very thing that would restore you, rest. Because the system cannot relax when it feels like it is still being judged. This is why the shift must be gentle, not by forcing yourself to forgive immediately, but by recognizing what is happening, seeing that this resistance to rest is not about the present moment. It is about an internal voice that believes you must keep carrying something. Once this is seen, something begins to loosen. You start to question the necessity of that voice. You begin to see that continuing to punish yourself does not create growth. It only creates exhaustion. And exhaustion does not lead to clarity. It leads to more tension. This is where a new approach begins. Instead of asking, "Have I done enough to deserve rest?" you begin to ask, "Is holding on to this helping me right now?" This question shifts the focus. It moves away from judgment and toward understanding. Because the truth is simple. Rest is not a reward, it is a need. The body does not require perfection to relax. It requires safety. And safety cannot exist where there is constant self-criticism. So tonight, there is nothing you need to prove to yourself. Nothing you need to correct. Nothing you need to carry forward. If there is guilt, let it be seen, not pushed away, not fed, just noticed. Because even guilt loses its grip when it is not being reinforced. You do not need to solve it right now. You do not need to make it disappear. You only need to stop building around it. And as you do, something begins to shift. The pressure softens. The tension loosens. The need to hold yourself in constant judgment begins to fade. And within that space, something new appears. Permission. Permission to rest without earning it. Permission to soften without explaining it. Permission to let go, even if everything does not feel perfect. This permission is not weakness. It is balance. Because without it, the system cannot restore itself. And as you allow that permission, even slightly, the body begins to respond. The breath deepens. The muscles release. The mind becomes less sharp. Because it is no longer being held in a state of quiet punishment. There is space again. Space for softness. Space for stillness. Space for rest. Not because everything has been resolved, but because nothing is being held against you anymore. And in that space, something gentle begins to settle. A quiet sense that you are allowed to be here, as you are, without needing to carry the weight of constant self-blame. And that is where the deepest kind of rest begins. Not forced, not earned, but finally allowed. And as that quiet permission begins to settle, another deeper habit begins to loosen. Not just the need to fix your day, not just the need to prove your worth, but the need to fix yourself before you are allowed to rest. There is a hidden belief many people carry into the night. The idea that before you can truly relax, you must understand yourself completely. You must figure out your patterns. You must solve your emotions. You must become clear about who you are and who you are becoming. So the mind begins to work again. It analyzes your behavior. It questions your choices. It tries to define your identity. Am I becoming better? Why do I feel this way? What is wrong with me? And what begins as reflection slowly turns into pressure. Because the self becomes something that must be figured out. Something that must be organized. Something that must make sense before the body is allowed to soften. This is where rest quietly disappears. Because there is no end to solving the self. There is always another layer, another question, another part that feels unclear. And if rest depends on complete understanding, it keeps getting delayed. Not for a moment, but again and again. The Stoics saw something very different. They did not treat the self as a problem to solve. They saw it as something to observe, something that unfolds over time, something that changes, shifts, and grows, without needing to be fully defined in a single moment. This perspective removes pressure, because it means you do not need to reach a final version of yourself tonight. You do not need to explain every feeling. You do not need to understand every reaction. You do not need to arrive at clarity before allowing yourself to rest. You are allowed to be in process, and this changes everything. Because when the self is seen as a process, not a problem, the mind no longer needs to fix it constantly. It can step back. It can observe. It can witness what is happening without turning it into something that must be resolved immediately. This is where patience begins, not forced patience, but natural patience. The kind that comes when you realize that not everything needs to be understood right now. There is a quiet mercy in this, a gentleness toward yourself that does not demand perfection, that does not demand clarity, that does not demand resolution. You begin to see your thoughts without chasing them. You begin to notice your emotions without needing to define them. You begin to experience yourself without turning it into a problem. And in that space, something softens. The mind becomes less sharp, less demanding, less driven to figure everything out. There is more room, more ease, more acceptance of what is. This does not mean you stop growing. It means you stop forcing growth in moments meant for rest. Because there is a time to reflect, and there is a time to release. Night is not always for solving. Sometimes it is for letting things remain open, for allowing the self to be incomplete without turning that into a problem. This is where deeper rest begins. Because the system is no longer being asked to resolve identity, it is being allowed to settle. So tonight, there is nothing you need to understand about yourself, nothing you need to define, nothing you need to solve. If a thought arises about who you are, let it pass. If a feeling appears that does not make sense, let it be. You do not need to reach clarity right now. You only need to witness, gently, without pressure, without judgment. Because you are not a question that needs an answer tonight. You are a process that is unfolding. And processes do not need to be completed to be at peace. They only need space. Space to move, space to exist, space to be. And as you allow that space, even quietly, something begins to shift. The need to analyze fades. The urge to define softens. The mind becomes less occupied with itself. And in that quieting, the body begins to relax, not because everything is understood, but because nothing is being forced into understanding. There is a softness here, a calm that does not depend on answers, a stillness that does not require resolution. And within that stillness, rest begins to deepen, not as something you achieve, but as something that naturally appears when you stop trying to solve yourself into peace. And that is where a deeper kind of healing begins. Slow, gentle, patient, allowing you to sleep not as a finished version of yourself, but as someone who is still becoming, and as the need to solve yourself begins to fade. Another quiet question rises. Not about who you are, but about what you are still carrying from the day that has already ended. Because even when the body lies down, the emotions of the day often do not. They linger. A small frustration that never fully settled. A conversation that left something unresolved. A moment that felt heavier than expected. These things do not always stay in the background. They travel with you into the night, into the silence, into the space where the mind begins to slow down. And when they arrive there, they do not simply disappear. They ask to be completed, not through action, but through awareness. Many people carry emotions forward without realizing it. They move from one moment to the next without pausing long enough to feel what has already happened. They keep going, keep adjusting, keep holding everything together. And in doing so, they never fully process what they have experienced. So the emotions remain open, not dramatic, but unfinished. And unfinished emotions do not rest easily. They stay active, They resurface as thoughts. They appear as tension. They create a sense that something is still in motion, even when everything around you is still. This is why the end of the day can feel heavy. Not because the day was too much, but because it was never fully released. The Stoics understood that emotional completion is not about eliminating feelings. It is about allowing them to reach their natural end. Every emotion has a cycle. It rises, it is felt, it moves, and then it settles. But when that cycle is interrupted, when the feeling is ignored, suppressed, or rushed past, it does not complete. It stays open. And the mind keeps returning to it, trying to finish something that was never allowed to finish. This is where a simple shift becomes powerful. Instead of carrying emotions forward, you begin to close them gently, not by forcing them away, but by giving them a moment of honest attention. You ask yourself, what am I still holding from today? Not as a question that needs a long answer, but as a quiet check. A moment of noticing. If there is frustration, you allow yourself to feel it without resistance. If there is sadness, you let it exist without pushing it aside. If there is tension, you notice where it sits in the body. This is not analysis. This is presence. Because emotions do not need to be explained to be completed. They need to be felt. And when they are felt, even briefly, they begin to move. The body releases. The mind softens. The sense of holding begins to fade. This is how closure happens, not through thinking, but through allowing. The Stoic path reminds you that you do not need to carry everything with you. Each day is its own experience, and when it ends, it is meant to be set down, not stored, not carried into the next moment, but left where it belongs. This does not mean you forget. It means you stop holding on to what no longer needs to be held. There is a quiet ritual in this, a way of letting the day close without forcing it. You acknowledge what happened, you allow what was felt, and then you release it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to create space, enough to let the system begin to rest. Because the body does not need every emotion to be solved. It only needs to know that it is not being ignored, and once it knows that, it begins to settle. So tonight, there is nothing you need to carry forward, nothing you need to keep processing, nothing you need to hold on to beyond this moment. If something from the day is still present, let it be felt, without resistance, without pressure, just for a moment, and then let it go. Not by pushing it away, but by allowing it to finish. Because not everything needs to follow you into tomorrow. Some things belong to today, and today is already complete. And as you allow that, something begins to shift. The weight lightens, the mind becomes quieter, the body softens more deeply. Because it is no longer holding on to what has already passed, there is space again, space for stillness, space for rest, space for the next moment to arrive without being crowded by the last one. And within that space, sleep begins to come more naturally, not because everything was perfect, but because nothing is being carried unnecessarily anymore. And that is where true rest begins, when the day is allowed to end, and you are finally free to follow it into quiet. And as the day is finally allowed to close, another quiet illusion begins to reveal itself. Not about what you carried, but about what you believe thinking is doing for you. Because there is a point where thinking feels like wisdom, but quietly becomes something else. There is a kind of thoughtfulness many people admire, the ability to reflect, to analyze, to go deeper than the surface. It feels like awareness. It feels like intelligence. It feels like growth. But there is another side to it, a side that is rarely noticed, a place where reflection stops being helpful, and starts becoming excessive, where thinking is no longer bringing clarity, but creating more noise. This is the illusion. The belief that more thinking always leads to more understanding. That if you just reflect longer, analyze deeper, question more, you will eventually arrive at peace. But often the opposite happens. The mind becomes crowded. It moves in circles. It creates complexity where there was once simplicity. And instead of clarity, there is confusion. Because not all thinking leads forward. Some thinking only loops. It revisits the same ideas again and again. It questions things that do not need to be questioned. It turns simple experiences into complicated problems. And beneath all of this, there is often something subtle, a quiet attachment to being the one who understands, the one who sees deeper, the one who reflects more than others. This is where thoughtfulness can quietly turn into self-absorption. Not in an obvious way, but in a way that keeps attention locked inward, constantly analyzing, constantly interpreting, constantly trying to reach a deeper level of understanding, and in doing so, missing the simplicity of the present moment. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that wisdom is not found in endless reflection. It is found in clear perception, in seeing what is, without adding unnecessary layers. Because excessive reflection can become a form of avoidance, a way of staying in the mind instead of experiencing life directly. It feels like depth. But often it is distance, distance from the body, distance from the moment, distance from rest. This is why the mind can feel tired even after long periods of thinking. Because it has not moved closer to clarity. It has moved deeper into complexity. There is a difference between useful reflection and unnecessary thinking. Useful reflection is brief. It brings insight, and then it ends. Unnecessary thinking continues. It keeps questioning. It keeps analyzing. It keeps searching for answers that may not even exist. And in that continuation, it becomes exhausting. The Stoic shift is simple, not to stop thinking completely, but to recognize when thinking is no longer helping, to notice when reflection has turned into repetition, when insight has turned into over-analysis, when clarity has turned into confusion, and in that moment, to stop, not forcefully, but gently, to step out of the loop, to return to something simpler, the breath, the body, the present moment. Because wisdom is not always found by going deeper into thought. Sometimes it is found by stepping out of it, by allowing things to be clear without needing to explain them further, by recognizing that not everything needs to be understood in words. There is a quiet confidence in this, a willingness to let understanding be enough, without stretching it, without turning it into something more. This is where the mind begins to settle, not because it has solved everything, but because it has stopped trying to. So tonight, there is nothing you need to analyze further, nothing you need to understand more deeply, nothing you need to figure out before you can rest. If a thought appears that invites more reflection, notice it, but do not follow it endlessly. Let it pass. Because not every thought leads to wisdom. Some only lead to more thinking. And when you stop following them, something begins to change. The mind becomes less crowded, less complicated, less driven to go deeper into itself. There is more space, more clarity, more ease, because you are no longer adding layers to what is already simple. You are allowing it to be, and in that simplicity, rest becomes closer. Not because everything has been understood, but because nothing is being overthought anymore. And that is where a quieter kind of wisdom begins to appear. Not in complexity, but in stillness, not in endless reflection, but in knowing when to stop. And within that stopping, the mind finally finds space to rest. And as the mind begins to step out of endless reflection, another quiet pattern becomes visible. Not about thinking too much, but about what the mind keeps returning to. There are pains you already understand, memories you have replayed many times, feelings you can almost predict, stories about yourself that feel familiar, even if they are heavy, and strangely, the mind keeps going back to them, not because they feel good, but because they feel known. There is a kind of safety in familiarity, even when that familiarity is painful. The mind prefers what it recognizes over what it does not. It would rather return to something uncomfortable that it understands than step into something calm that feels unfamiliar. This is where the quiet attachment to pain begins. It is not always conscious. You may not want to feel it, but you know how to. You know the thoughts that come with it. You know the emotions it brings. You know how it unfolds. And because of that, the mind returns. It clings. Not because the pain is wanted, but because it is predictable. Peace, on the other hand, can feel different. It does not follow the same patterns. It does not have the same intensity. It does not give the mind something to hold on to. And because of that, it can feel unfamiliar, even uncertain. The Stoics understood this deeply. They saw that human beings often resist what is new, even when it is better for them, not out of weakness, but out of habit. The mind becomes used to certain emotional states, used to certain patterns of thinking, and when those patterns begin to change, there is a moment of discomfort, a moment where the system does not quite know how to respond. This is where release becomes difficult, because letting go of familiar pain does not just remove discomfort, it removes something known, something that has been part of your inner world for a long time. And the mind asks, who am I without this? What do I hold on to if this is gone? This question is not always clear, but it is felt, and so the mind returns to the familiar. It revisits old thoughts. It reactivates known emotions. It keeps the pattern alive, because even though it is heavy, it feels stable. This is why some people stay in cycles they understand. Instead of stepping into calm, they do not. Not because they want to suffer, but because suffering has become structured, recognizable, predictable. The Stoic shift begins with awareness, seeing that familiarity is not the same as safety, that just because something feels known does not mean it needs to be kept. You begin to notice when the mind is returning to the same pain, not because it is necessary, but because it is familiar. And in that noticing, something changes. You are no longer fully inside the pattern. You are observing it. And from that place, a choice appears. Not a forced decision, but a gentle option. You can stay with what you know, or you can allow something new. This is where patience is needed, because unfamiliar peace does not feel natural immediately. It may feel quiet in a way that seems empty. It may feel still in a way that seems uncertain. But this does not mean it is wrong. It means it is new. The body and mind need time to adjust, time to recognize that this quieter state is not a loss, but a release. So tonight, if the mind begins to return to something painful that it already understands, notice it. Do not judge it. Do not fight it. Just see it. See how it pulls you back. See how it feels familiar. And gently, do not follow it. Let it be there without stepping into it fully. This is how the pattern begins to weaken, not through force, but through non-participation. And as you stay with that, even briefly, something begins to shift. The pull becomes less strong. The need to return becomes less automatic. The system begins to open to something different, something quieter, something less familiar, but lighter. This is where peace begins to take root, not as something dramatic, but as something subtle, a space where the mind is not occupied by old patterns, a moment where the body is not carrying the same weight, a feeling that is not intense but steady. And as this becomes more familiar, the need to cling to pain begins to fade, because the mind starts to learn that it does not need to return to what it already knows. It can move forward, gently, slowly, without losing itself. And in that movement, rest becomes deeper. Not because pain has been forced away, but because it is no longer being held onto. And that is where a new kind of ease begins to emerge. Quiet, unfamiliar at first, but real. And finally, free. And as the mind begins to loosen its grip on familiar pain, another deeper tension becomes visible. Not just the thoughts you return to, but the state your body has been living in for far too long. A quiet readiness, not loud, not obvious, but always there. A sense that something might go wrong, a feeling that you need to stay prepared, a subtle tightening, as if you are waiting for disappointment before it even arrives. This is not panic, it is something quieter, a low-grade alertness that never fully turns off. It lives in the body more than the mind, in the way the shoulders never completely drop, in the way the breath never fully deepens, in the way rest feels incomplete, even when you try to relax. This is the cost of constant readiness. At some point, the system learned that being prepared protects you, that expecting the worst reduces the impact, that staying slightly tense keeps you from being caught off guard. And so it adapted. It became vigilant, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, ongoing way. Always watching, always braced, always holding just enough tension to respond quickly. At first, this may have been useful. It may have helped you navigate difficult situations. It may have given you a sense of control, but over time, it becomes something else. A habit, a baseline, a way of existing that the body no longer questions. This is where the inner collapse begins, because the body is not designed to stay in readiness all the time. It needs cycles, moments of activation, and moments of release. But when release never fully happens, the system stays in a state of low-level alarm. Not enough to feel like panic, but enough to prevent deep rest. This is why some people feel tired, even when nothing is happening, because the body is still working, still monitoring, still holding, as if something could go wrong at any moment. The Stoics understood this pattern in a simple but powerful way. They saw that much of human tension comes from anticipating what has not yet happened, from preparing for disappointment before it arrives, from living in a constant state of just in case. But they also saw the cost, because when you expect difficulty at all times, you never fully allow ease. You never fully trust the moment. You never fully let the body settle, and over time, this creates exhaustion, not from events, but from anticipation. The system becomes tired of being ready, tired of holding tension, tired of staying alert for something that is not even here. This is where the shift begins, not by forcing yourself to relax, but by noticing the readiness, seeing it clearly, feeling it in the body, without trying to change it immediately. You may notice the slight tightening in the chest, the subtle holding in the stomach, the way the breath pauses instead of flowing. These are not problems. They are signals. Signals that the body is still expecting something, and once you see that, something becomes possible. You can begin to show the body that nothing is happening right now, not through words, but through presence, through staying in the moment without adding anticipation, through allowing the body to feel what it feels, without reinforcing the need to stay ready. This is not instant, because the habit of readiness is strong, but each moment of not feeding it begins to change the pattern. When you notice tension and do not add more tension, the system begins to soften. When you feel the urge to prepare and do not follow it, the body begins to trust. When you remain in stillness without expecting something to go wrong, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. This is how safety is relearned, not by convincing the mind, but by showing the body, again and again, that this moment is not a threat. So tonight, there is nothing you need to prepare for, nothing you need to brace against, nothing you need to expect. If the body feels slightly tense, let it be. Do not force it to relax. Just stay with it, gently, without adding the story that something is about to happen. Because the more you remain present without anticipation, the more the system begins to change. The readiness softens, the tension begins to release, the breath deepens, not because you made it happen, but because the body no longer feels the need to stay on guard. This is where deep rest begins to return, not through effort, but through the absence of constant preparation. The system begins to understand that it does not need to stay ready all the time, that it is allowed to release, that it is safe to rest. And as this understanding settles, even slowly, something shifts. The inner collapse begins to reverse. The body feels less strained, less held together, more supported, more at ease, because it is no longer carrying the weight of constant expectation. It is simply here, in this moment, with nothing to prepare for, nothing to brace against, nothing to hold. And in that space, rest becomes deeper. Not because everything is certain, but because nothing is being anticipated anymore. And that is where the body finally begins to let go, fully, gently, and without resistance. And as the body begins to release that constant readiness, another deeper layer of weight comes into view. Not just the tension of anticipation, but the quiet burden of who you believe you have to be. There are roles many people carry without ever choosing them. The one who must always be strong, the one who must not disappoint, the one who must hold everything together. These roles are not always spoken out loud. They are absorbed from family, from expectations, from moments where you learned that being a certain way kept things stable, kept people pleased, kept conflict away. And over time, these roles become identity, not something you do, but something you feel you are. So even when the day ends, the role does not. The body lies down, but the identity stays active, still responsible, still alert, still carrying. This is the spiritual weight of unchosen roles. It is not physical, but it is heavy, because it requires constant effort. Effort to maintain an image, effort to meet expectations, effort to avoid stepping outside of what you have been shaped into. And the most exhausting part is this. You may not even realize you are carrying it. It feels normal. It feels like who you are. But underneath, there is a quiet strain, a sense that you cannot fully relax. Because if you do, you might stop being that role, and that feels uncertain. This is where the Stoics offer something deeply freeing. They remind you that identity is not something you inherit blindly. It is something you examine, something you choose. They asked simple but powerful questions. What is truly within your control? What is truly aligned with your values? Not what was expected of you, not what was assigned to you, but what is actually yours to carry. Because not every role you have taken on belongs to you. Some were learned, some were assumed, some were adopted out of fear or out of the need to be accepted. And when these roles are never questioned, they become heavy. They create a life that feels managed, but not free. A life where rest is difficult, because the identity never steps down. Even in silence, even in stillness, the role continues. This is why the body feels tired in a deeper way, not just from what you do, but from who you feel you must always be. The Stoic path does not ask you to reject responsibility. It asks you to see it clearly, to separate what is truly yours from what was placed on you, to notice where you are acting from choice and where you are acting from habit. This noticing changes everything, because once you see that a role is not fully yours, it begins to loosen. You do not need to drop it completely, but you no longer hold it as tightly. You begin to allow yourself moments where you are not performing it, moments where you are simply present, without needing to be strong, without needing to be perfect, without needing to meet an invisible expectation. At first, this may feel unfamiliar, because the identity has been there for a long time, but even a small step back creates space. Space where the body can soften, space where the mind can quiet, space where you are no longer carrying everything at once. This is where a deeper kind of rest begins, not just physical, but existential. A rest from being, a rest from holding a version of yourself together. So tonight, there is nothing you need to be, no role you need to maintain, no expectation you need to fulfill. You are not required to carry every identity into this moment. If you feel the weight of who you have been, notice it, but do not hold it so tightly. Let it sit beside you instead of on top of you, because you are more than the roles you have learned, and you are allowed to step out of them, even briefly, even quietly, and as you do, something begins to shift. The pressure fades, the tension softens, the need to perform begins to loosen. The body feels lighter, because it is no longer carrying something that was never fully chosen. There is space again, space to breathe, space to exist, space to rest, not as a role, but as yourself, without needing to define that self completely, without needing to hold it together, just being. And in that being, something gentle begins to settle. A sense of freedom, a sense of release, a sense that you are no longer bound to what you have always carried. And within that space, rest becomes deeper. Not because everything has been resolved, but because something has finally been set down, and that is where a quieter kind of peace begins to unfold, steady, unforced, and finally, your own. And as that weight of unchosen roles begins to fall away, something even more subtle reveals itself. Not what you are carrying, but how tightly you have been trying to manage yourself this whole time. There is a quiet effort many people never notice. The effort to control every part of their inner world, to breathe correctly, to relax properly, to think the right thoughts, to follow the perfect method that will finally bring peace. It seems helpful. It feels like discipline. But over time, it becomes something else. A constant self-management, a subtle pressure to get everything right inside yourself. And this pressure does not rest. Even in stillness there is effort. Am I doing this correctly? Is my mind calm enough? Should I adjust something right now? This is where another layer of tension lives, not from chaos, but from control. The Stoics understood something deeply counterintuitive, that not all healing comes from doing more. Sometimes it comes from stopping, from ending the quiet violence of trying to manage yourself perfectly, because even gentle control, when constant, becomes strain. The body feels it. in the tightness that does not fully release, in the breath that is guided instead of allowed, in the subtle sense that something is always being adjusted. This is not relaxation, it is controlled relaxation, and the body knows the difference. True rest does not come from perfect technique, it comes from surrender. Not surrender as giving up, but surrender as allowing the breath to move on its own, allowing the body to settle without instruction, allowing the mind to be as it is, without trying to shape it into something better. This can feel unfamiliar, because the habit of self-management is strong. The mind may want to step in. It may say, "You should do this better." It may say, "Adjust this." It may say, "Try harder." But notice that voice. It is the same pattern, the same effort, the same subtle control that has been there all along, and for a moment, you do not need to follow it. You can let it pass. You can remain here without doing anything about it. This is where something begins to change. The system starts to experience a different state. Not controlled calm, but natural calm. At first, it may feel strange, because there is no structure, no technique to follow, no clear action to take, just presence, just allowing. And in that allowing, the body begins to respond. The breath becomes softer, the muscles release more deeply, the nervous system shifts, not because it was directed, but because it was given space. This is where real restoration begins, not through effort, but through the absence of effort. The Stoics did not try to force the world into order. They aligned with it. They allowed what was outside their control to be, and in doing so, they found peace. The same applies here. You do not need to control every internal movement. You do not need to perfect your state. You do not need to manage every sensation. You can let it be. And in that letting be, something settles. The body no longer feels watched, no longer feels adjusted, no longer feels like it is being guided towards something. It simply returns to its natural rhythm. So tonight, there is nothing you need to do. No method to follow, no technique to perfect. If the breath is shallow, let it be shallow. If the body is tense, let it be tense. If the mind is active, let it be active, not as something to fix, but as something to allow. Because the moment you stop trying to control it, you remove the pressure, and when the pressure is gone, the system begins to soften on its own. This is the paradox. The more you try to manage yourself into peace, the further it moves away. The more you allow yourself as you are, the closer it comes. And as you stay with that, even gently, something shifts. The effort fades. The tension loosens. The need to control becomes quieter. And in its place, there is something simpler, a natural ease. A calm that does not require maintenance, a stillness that is not being created, but revealed. And within that stillness, rest deepens, not because you achieved it, but because you stopped interfering with it. And that is where the deepest kind of healing begins, quietly, without effort, without force. Just through the simple act of surrender. And as that surrender begins to open space, something even more subtle comes into view. Not the effort to control anymore, but the quiet resistance to something much simpler. Peace itself. There is a strange moment that happens when everything begins to soften. The thoughts slow down. The body starts to settle. The noise fades into the background. And instead of fully relaxing, something in the mind pulls back. Not loudly, but enough to interrupt the stillness. A thought appears, a question forms, a need to re-engage returns, It feels almost automatic, as if the mind does not quite trust how simple this moment has become. This is where another hidden pattern reveals itself, the resistance to simple peace. Because for a long time the mind has been operating in complexity, solving problems, analyzing situations, carrying tension, navigating difficulty, and in that process, identity begins to form. You become the one who handles things, the one who thinks deeply, the one who pushes through. Struggle becomes familiar, effort becomes normal, and over time, the mind begins to associate complexity with value, with meaning, with importance. So when peace arrives, quietly, without effort, without complexity, it can feel too plain, too empty, too different from what the mind is used to. There is a subtle voice that says, "This cannot be enough. There must be more to figure out. There must be something missing." And so, the mind re-enters activity, not because it needs to, but because it is protecting an identity built on struggle. The Stoics understood this deeply. They saw that the ego often attaches itself to difficulty, because difficulty feels like effort, and effort feels like purpose. But peace, simple, steady, quiet peace, does not require that same effort. It does not demand constant thinking. It does not require solving. It simply exists. And this can feel unfamiliar to a mind that has been trained to earn everything. There is a quiet discomfort in receiving peace without working for it, because it challenges the belief that you must struggle to deserve calm. So the mind complicates things again. It creates new thoughts, new questions, new layers, anything to return to what it knows. This is not failure, it is habit. And habits can change, but only when they are seen clearly. When you notice this resistance, something becomes possible. You can pause, not forcefully, but gently. You can see the moment when peace is present, and the mind tries to move away from it. And instead of following that movement, you can stay, even if it feels unfamiliar, even if it feels too simple, even if it feels like nothing is happening, because nothing needing to happen is the point. This is where the shift begins, not by adding more understanding, but by allowing less interference. You begin to see that peace does not need to be complex to be real. It does not need to be earned to be valid. It does not need to be filled with meaning to be enough. It is enough as it is. And as you stay with that, something softens. The need to complicate fades. The urge to re-engage weakens. The identity built on struggle begins to loosen, because it is no longer being reinforced. There is space now, space where you are not solving, not proving, not becoming, just present. This presence may feel quiet, but it is not empty. It is full in a different way, full of ease, full of steadiness, full of a kind of calm that does not need explanation. And within that space, the body begins to trust. The nervous system begins to settle more deeply, because it is no longer being pulled back into effort. It is allowed to remain here. So tonight, if peace begins to appear, do not move away from it. Do not question it. Do not try to add to it. Just stay. Even if it feels too simple, even if it feels unfamiliar, because the simplicity is not the problem. It is the doorway. And as you remain there, even gently, something changes. The resistance fades. The mind becomes quieter. The body becomes heavier in a calm, grounded way. And peace no longer feels like something strange. It begins to feel natural, familiar, safe. And in that familiarity, rest deepens. Not because something complex was achieved, but because nothing needed to be added anymore. And that is where the mind finally begins to let go. Not into effort, but into simplicity, where everything is already enough, and nothing more is required. And as that simple peace begins to feel more familiar, another quiet distinction starts to emerge. Not about thinking, not about identity, but about how you leave the day behind. Because not all endings are the same. There are nights when the mind tries to escape the day. And there are nights when the day is truly released. They can look similar from the outside. The body lies down, the eyes close, the noise fades. But inside, something very different is happening. Escaping the day is a form of avoidance. It is the attempt to move away from what was felt, without actually meeting it. The mind distracts itself. It scrolls, it watches, it fills the space with noise until it is too tired to continue. It tries to outrun the weight of the day. And eventually, exhaustion wins. But nothing is truly resolved. The emotions remain unfinished. The tension stays in the body. The mind has simply paused, not settled. This is why sleep after escape often feels shallow, because the system has not been allowed to close. It has only been numbed. Numbing feels like relief, but it is temporary, because what is avoided does not disappear. It waits. And when the silence returns, it rises again. The Stoics understood this difference clearly. They did not seek to escape experience. They sought to meet it fully, and then release it. Because only what is acknowledged can be completed. Only what is seen can be let go. This is where surrender becomes different from avoidance. Surrender is not running away, it is staying, not forcing, not analyzing endlessly, but allowing the day to exist as it was. You feel what is still present, without exaggerating it, without suppressing it, without turning it into something bigger. Just enough awareness to let it move. This is conscious closure, a quiet moment where you allow the day to settle within you, not through effort, but through presence. You notice what remains, a small tension, a lingering thought, a feeling that has not fully passed. And instead of avoiding it, you stay with it, gently, without trying to fix it immediately. This staying is enough, because emotions do not need to be forced out. They need space to finish. And when they are given that space, they begin to soften. They lose their intensity. They stop asking for attention. This is where the difference becomes clear. Escaping leaves things open. Releasing allows them to close. The Stoic path guides you toward this kind of closing. Not by pushing the day away, but by letting it complete itself. Because every experience has a natural end, it only remains active when it is interrupted. So tonight, there is no need to escape. No need to fill the space. No need to distract yourself from what is already here. If something from the day is still present, let it be seen, without judgment, without resistance, without turning away, just long enough for it to settle, and then let it go. Not by forcing it out, but by no longer holding it in place. This is where the system begins to change. The body softens more deeply. The mind becomes quieter, because nothing is being avoided, nothing is being pushed aside. Everything that needed to be felt has been allowed, and once it has been allowed, it no longer needs to stay. There is a quiet completion here, a sense that the day has truly ended, not because it was perfect, but because it has been fully met, and in that completion, something opens, a deeper stillness, a more grounded calm, a kind of rest that does not depend on distraction, because nothing is waiting underneath it. So tonight, choose presence over escape. Choose awareness over avoidance, not as effort, but as a gentle willingness to stay with what is. And as you do, even briefly, something begins to settle. The difference becomes clear. You are no longer running from the day. You are allowing it to end. And in that ending, rest becomes deeper, not forced, not borrowed, but real, because nothing has been left unfinished, nothing has been hidden, nothing has been carried forward. There is only this moment now, quiet, complete, and finally, at peace. And as the day is no longer being escaped and truly begins to release, something deeper comes into view. Not about what happened today, but about something much larger that quietly shapes how tightly you hold everything. The fact that all of this is temporary. There is a subtle tension that comes from living as if everything must be held on to, as if every moment must be managed, as if every outcome must be secured, as if everything is urgent and everything must be controlled. But underneath that urgency, there is a quiet forgetting that life itself is not something you can hold forever. The Stoics did not avoid this truth. They returned to it often, not to create fear, but to create clarity. Because when you remember that your time is limited, something begins to shift, not in a heavy way, but in a softening way. The things that once felt overwhelming begin to lose their weight. The need to control every detail begins to loosen. The urgency that once drove the mind begins to fade, because you begin to see. Not everything needs to be carried so tightly. There is a kind of tension that comes from believing everything must last, that every moment must be preserved, that every problem must be solved immediately. But when you see that everything is passing, something changes. The grip softens, the body begins to release. Because it no longer feels responsible for holding on to something that was never meant to be permanent. This is where mortality awareness becomes freeing, not frightening. Because it removes pressure. It reminds you that this moment is not something you need to perfect. It is something you are simply moving through. The Stoics called this a return to perspective, seeing life as it is, not endless, not fully controllable, but meaningful in its passing. And when this perspective settles, the nervous system responds. The constant alertness begins to fade. The need to rush begins to soften. The body no longer feels like it must stay tense to keep everything together. Because it understands, even if quietly, that not everything needs to be held. There is a deeper permission here, a permission to let things be incomplete, to let moments pass without needing to capture them perfectly, to allow life to move without resisting its movement. This is where a different kind of calm appears, not the calm of control, but the calm of acceptance. You begin to feel that you do not need to solve everything tonight. You do not need to prepare for everything tomorrow. You do not need to carry everything forward, because life itself is already moving. And you are part of that movement, not in control of it, not separate from it, but within it. This understanding does something powerful. It takes urgency and softens it. It takes pressure and loosens it. It takes tension and begins to dissolve it, not through force, but through perspective. So tonight there is nothing you need to hold on to, nothing you need to preserve, nothing you need to make perfect before you rest. This moment does not need to be secured, it only needs to be experienced. And as you allow that, even gently, something shifts. The body begins to release more deeply. The breath becomes slower. The mind becomes quieter. Because it is no longer trying to hold on to something that cannot be held forever. There is space again. Space to simply be. Space to exist without urgency. space to rest without needing to prepare for everything that could come next. This is where the nervous system begins to settle fully, not because everything is certain, but because nothing needs to be controlled in this moment. There is a quiet trust here, a trust in the unfolding of life, a trust that you do not need to manage every part of it. And within that trust, something gentle begins to take over. The body softens, the mind releases, the system lets go. Not because everything has been figured out, but because nothing is being held against the flow anymore. And that is where the deepest kind of rest begins, not in certainty, but in acceptance, not in control, but in release. And within that release, there is a quiet peace, wide, steady, and finally, free enough to let you rest completely. And as that deeper perspective begins to settle, another quiet source of exhaustion reveals itself. Not from the past, not from the future, but from the subtle resistance to where you are right now. There is a kind of tiredness that does not come from effort alone. It comes from wishing to be somewhere else, a different stage of life, a different version of yourself, a different set of circumstances that feels easier, clearer, or more aligned. This desire is not always loud. Sometimes it is just a quiet background feeling, a sense that this moment is not quite right, that things should be further along, that life should feel different by now. And because of that, the present moment becomes something to endure, not something to live. This is the hidden fatigue, the exhaustion of constantly leaning away from where you are, because when the mind resists the current season of life, it creates tension, not just mental tension, but physical. The body feels it in the restlessness that does not settle, in the inability to fully relax, in the subtle pressure that says, this is not enough. Even when nothing is happening, there is resistance. And resistance requires energy. It keeps the system active. It prevents full release, because part of you is always pushing against reality. The Stoics understood this in a simple but profound way. They taught that suffering often comes not from circumstances, but from resisting them, not in the sense of giving up or becoming passive, but in the sense of refusing to mentally fight what already is. Because when you fight the present moment, you divide yourself. One part of you is here, another part of you is somewhere else, in imagination, in comparison, in desire. And this division creates strain. You are not fully in one place. You are stretched between two, and the body feels that stretch as fatigue. This is why even stillness can feel tiring, because the mind is not resting in it. It is rejecting it, trying to move beyond it, trying to replace it with something better. But peace does not come from escaping the present. It comes from entering it fully, from allowing this moment, as it is, to be enough for now. This is where the Stoic shift begins, not by forcing yourself to love everything about your situation, but by ending the quiet argument with it. You stop saying, this should not be happening. You stop saying, I should be somewhere else. And instead, you allow this moment to exist, without resistance, without comparison, without the constant push to move beyond it. This does not mean you stop growing. It means you stop rejecting where growth is currently happening. Because every stage of life has its place, even the uncomfortable ones, even the unclear ones, even the ones that feel like waiting. And when you allow yourself to be here fully, something begins to change. The tension softens, the pressure fades. The need to escape begins to loosen, because the system is no longer being pulled in two directions. It is allowed to settle into one. This is where the body begins to rest more deeply. Because it is no longer carrying the effort of resistance, It is no longer being pushed away from the present. It is simply here. So tonight, there is nowhere else you need to be. No other version of life you need to step into. No different moment you need to reach before you can rest. This moment, as it is enough. Not forever, but for now. And that is all that is needed. If the mind begins to drift into what should be, notice it, but gently return back to where you are, back to the body, back to the breath, back to the quiet reality of this moment. Because this moment is not a punishment. It is not something to endure. It is the only place where rest can actually happen. And as you allow that, even slightly, something shifts. The restlessness begins to fade. The body becomes heavier in a calm way. The mind becomes less divided, because it is no longer trying to be somewhere else. There is a quiet acceptance here, not forced, not dramatic, just a simple willingness to be where you are. And within that willingness, something opens, a deeper ease, a steadier calm, a kind of rest that does not depend on changing your life first, because nothing is being resisted anymore, nothing is being pushed away. There is only this moment, and in this moment, there is space to breathe, space to soften, space to rest, fully, gently, without needing to be anywhere else at all. Tonight was never about fixing your life. It was about putting it down. All the noise you carried, the roles you held, the thoughts you chased, the pressure to become, to prove, to understand. None of it needed to follow you into this moment. What you discovered here is simple, but powerful. You don't need to solve everything to rest. You don't need to understand everything to be at peace. You don't need to carry everything to be enough. The Stoics knew this long before us, that peace begins the moment resistance ends, that the mind becomes quiet when it stops fighting itself, and that the body finally lets go, when nothing is being held against it anymore. So if something inside you feels lighter right now, even just a little, that is not an accident. That is what happens when you stop interfering with your own calm. And if you made it this far, I want you to do something simple. Go down into the comments and write, "I let go." Not for me, but for yourself. A quiet signal that tonight you chose release over resistance. And if this helped you in any way, subscribe to the channel and stay with this journey. Because the more you return to this kind of stillness, the more natural it becomes. Now, there is nothing left to carry, nothing left to solve. Just let go and rest.